Gerald Pritchard didn't even look at her when he grabbed the suitcase. Just yanked it from her hand one sharp, dismissive motion and hurled it off the platform edge into the frozen mud below. The latch gave, the side split. Everything Vivian Ashford owned in the world spilled across the ground. 2 folded dresses, a child's wool sock, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, a small photograph with a cracked corner. Station platform went quiet. A 5-year-old girl in a thin coat watched her mother's life scatter in the dirt and said nothing. Just reached up and took hold of Vivian's hand. Pritchard adjusted his vest. Station's closing in 10 minutes. You and your girl need to move along. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she climbed down off that platform, got on her knees in the frozen mud, and started gathering what was hers. If you've ever had someone treat you like you were nothing, like your entire existence was an inconvenience, then you already know exactly what she felt in that moment. If you want to know how a woman who started in that mud ended up changing everything in this story, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Train that brought Vivian Ashford to Millhaven arrived 40 minutes late, which should have been her first warning that nothing about this day was going to go the way she'd planned. She had been awake since before dawn, sitting rigid in the passenger car with Molly asleep across her lap, watching the landscape outside the window change from brown plains to frozen scrub to something that looked less like a frontier town and more like an afterthought. Collection of buildings that someone had dropped in the middle of nothing and then mostly forgotten about. Millhaven. Population, according to the letter she'd received, of just over 400 souls. The letter. She still had it in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The ink faded to gray at the creases. Thomas Aldean had written to her through the placement service back in Ohio 8 months ago, and he had written well. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the weeks since she'd made her decision. He wrote like a man who thought carefully, like a man who understood that words had weight. He described his ranch outside Millhaven, his cattle operation, his need for a capable woman to share the work of building something lasting. Never once used the word love. She had respected that. She hadn't wanted poetry. She had wanted honesty. She thought she'd found it. Molly stirred when the train lurched to a stop, blinking up at her mother with the particular confusion of a child woken from deep sleep. "Are we there?" "We're there," Vivian said. "Is the man going to be at the station?" Plan. Molly considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who had learned not to take plans too seriously. What if he's not? Vivian had no answer for that, so she helped her daughter into her coat and gathered their things and moved toward the exit before the question could settle. Platform at Millhaven Station was small and mostly empty. A few men unloading freight from the rear cars. A woman in a heavy shawl waiting for someone who stepped off 2 cars ahead. Station employee with a bored expression sweeping near the far end of the platform, moving the same pile of grit back and forth without actually removing it from anywhere. Vivian stood with her suitcase at her feet and her daughter beside her and looked at every face on that platform. Thomas Aldean was not among them. She told herself it was fine. Trains ran late. Roads were unreliable this time of year. The man running a ranch couldn't always predict exactly when he'd make it to town. She told herself all of this calmly, and then set about locating the station master to ask whether anyone had left a message for her. Gerald Pritchard had a small office just inside the station door, and he looked at her the way certain men look at women traveling alone, like a calculation was happening behind his eyes, one she wasn't going to like the result of. "I'm looking for Thomas Aldean," she said. "He was supposed to meet me this morning." "I'm Vivian Ashford. I've come from Ohio." Pritchard leaned back in his chair. "Aldean, yes. He owns property northeast of town. Cattle operation." Something shifted in Pritchard's face. Not surprise exactly. More like a decision being made about how much to say. "Aldean sold his ranch," he said. "Moved on, I'd say, about 2 months back." Words didn't make sense at first. Vivian heard them, understood individually what each one meant, but couldn't assemble them into something that matched the reality she was standing in. "That's not possible," she said. "I received a letter from him 6 weeks ago." "Can't speak to letters. Just know what I know." "Then perhaps he left word with you. A forwarding address or a message." Nobody left anything for anyone. Pritchard stood, and he was taller than she'd expected, his expression settling into something that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't far from it either. "Look, miss whatever your name was. I don't know your situation, and I don't have room to care. This station closes at 6 and I've got work to finish. I have nowhere to go, she said. She hated saying it. Words felt like something being pulled out of her throat against her will. She said them because they were true. She had learned in the past 2 years that the truth, even when it humbled you, was the only currency that sometimes bought help. I've come across the country with my daughter. I have no lodging arranged. I have very little money. I am simply asking if you can direct me to someone who might assist. That's not my concern, Pritchard said. I understand it's not your obligation. Common lady. He cut her off flat. I said it's not my concern. Came around the desk. She thought for a moment he was going to show her out, point her towards someone else, anything. Instead, he walked straight past her, out the door, onto the platform, gun, and picked up her suitcase. She followed, saying, "What are you?" He threw it. One arm, clean and deliberate, like he was tossing out something that had already been decided to be garbage. Suitcase hit the edge of the platform, tumbled, and landed hard in the mud at the base of the station steps. Impact was enough. The latch she'd been meaning to get repaired since before she left Ohio gave way, and the sides buckled outward, and everything inside distributed itself across the frozen ground below. She stood at the edge of the platform and looked at it. Her blue dress, the gray one with the repaired collar. Molly's extra stockings, rolled together the way Molly liked them because it made her feel grown up to pack them herself. A small photograph of her and her husband taken the year before Molly was born. The one where he was laughing at something just out of frame and she was looking at him instead of the camera. Glenn the glass had cracked somewhere in the journey, and she'd wrapped it in a handkerchief to keep the pieces together. The letters, all of Thomas Aldine's letters, bound with kitchen twine, now loose and sliding apart in the mud. Pritchard had already gone back inside. Vivian became aware that her daughter had taken hold of her hand. Small fingers were cold, even through both their gloves. She looked down. Molly was watching her with those steady gray eyes she'd inherited from her father, eyes that always seemed to be doing more looking than their age should have allowed. "Mama," Molly said quietly, "are we staying here tonight?" Vivian stepped off the platform. She did not answer the question. She got down on her knees in the mud, which was cold enough to bite right through her skirt, and she began gathering what belonged to her. Dress by dress, stocking by stocking. She picked up the photograph in its broken frame and tucked it against her chest and held it there while she reached for the letters with her other hand. Twine had come undone, but the letters themselves were mostly intact, only the outer envelope having caught the worst of the mud. She worked without hurrying. There was something she'd learned in the months after her husband's death, the slow disintegration of everything she'd built with him, the house they'd had to surrender, business creditors she'd had to face, relatives who had appeared helpful at the funeral and then stopped returning letters, and what she'd learned was this: panic never helped you move faster. It only made you drop things twice. Molly crouched down beside her and picked up a stocking without being asked. By the time the suitcase was repacked messily, the broken latch held with a length of rope she'd had in her coat pocket for exactly this kind of emergency. She'd become a woman who carried rope for exactly this kind of emergency. The platform above them had emptied. Freight workers had gone. The woman in the shawl was gone. And the bored man with the broom had retreated inside. Temperature was dropping. Vivian stood, one hand on the suitcase handle, the other holding Molly's. She had $14.60 in the small purse she kept pinned to the inside of her coat. She had no idea whether Millhaven had a boarding house, whether it accepted women traveling alone, or whether $14.60 would cover more than a night or two if it did. She knew no one in this town. She had come west on the promise of a man who had apparently sold his ranch and departed without the courtesy of informing the woman he'd been corresponding with for 8 months that her plans had ceased to exist. She made herself breathe slowly. Think, Vivian, one thing at a time. First, find somewhere warm before dark. Second, figure out what Millhaven had by way of lodging. Third, determine whether there was any work available, any at all, that could buy her more time while she worked out a plan. She had done harder things than this. She had sat beside her husband's bed for 11 days while he died of pneumonia, managing his affairs between visits, selling what needed to be sold, being present for every moment while simultaneously dismantling everything they'd built together so that when he was gone, she wouldn't be crushed beneath the weight of it. She had done that. She could walk to the end of a street in an unfamiliar frontier town and find a door that was open. She picked up the suitcase. "Come on, Bug," she said to Molly. They had made it as far as the end of the platform steps when she heard the wagon. Came in from the North Road, a working ranch wagon with 2 bay horses and a man handling the reins who drove like someone used to covering distance without wasting movement. He pulled up short when he saw them, or rather, when his horses shied slightly at the unexpected presence of a woman and child standing in the road with a broken-latched suitcase tied with rope. Gah! He looked at them. They looked at him. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been outdoors in difficult weather for long enough that the lines in it meant something. Not handsome in a storybook way, but solid, a face that looked like it had made a lot of decisions and hadn't been destroyed by most of them. His coat was heavy and practical, and there was mud on his boots that matched the mud on Vivian's knees. Stations that way, he said, meaning behind them. I'm aware, she said. He glanced at Molly, then back at Vivian. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite a question yet. Waiting for someone? I was. She kept her voice level. She was not going to explain herself on a road to a stranger, not unless she had to. I'm looking for lodging. Is there a boarding house in town? Was, he said. Closed about a year back. There's a hotel on Main Street, far end. Thank you. She started walking. He didn't move the wagon. She was aware of this the way you become aware of something that isn't quite making the noise you expect, like a door that doesn't latch right, a low sound that stops being background. How long have you been at the station? He asked. She didn't stop walking. Since the train arrived. Train arrived at 11. Then since 11. Pause. Horses shifted. It's past 3. I know what time it is. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, not softer exactly, but considered. Like he was deciding something. Nathan Whitmore. I own the W northeast of town, about 6 miles. She stopped. She turned. She looked at him. There was something in the way he'd said northeast of town that had caught in her mind, snagged on something specific. Thomas Aldean had been northeast of town too. Not 6 miles, if she remembered correctly, closer to 4, but close enough that the same man in a wagon on the same road might know. Might have crossed paths. Did you know a man named Thomas Aldean? She asked. Something crossed Whitmore's face. Quickly, but she caught it. I knew of him. He was supposed to meet me here. I came from Ohio. We had an arrangement. She stopped herself from calling it what it had been. Word felt diminished now, soaked in mud the way her skirt was. He's apparently gone. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Aldean left in October. Sold the property to a land company out of the Eastern Territories. Didn't give much notice to anyone. October. She had received his last letter in November. Had he written it before he left? Set it on a timer somehow? Had he known by the time she read it that she had no one to arrive to? Or had someone else been sending correspondence in his name? Cold settled differently in her chest. Not shock. Something colder than shock. The specific sensation of understanding that a thing you believed was solid was never solid at all, and you had been balancing on it for 8 months. I see, she said. Molly was watching her. Vivian squeezed her daughter's hand once and made herself look back at the man in the wagon. Thank you for the information, she said, and for telling me about the hotel. She started walking again. She heard him climb down from the wagon. Boots hit the road behind her. Mrs. Ashford. Mrs. Ashford. He came around to stand in her path, not blocking it, just present. Up close he was bigger than he'd seemed from the wagon, but he held himself without weight, the way people do who aren't trying to take up more space than they need. I'm not going to pretend I understand your situation entirely, but I run a large operation, and I'm currently without a housekeeper and anyone to manage the domestic accounts. I had someone until last month. It's real work. It pays a fair wage, enough for you and your girl to have decent rooms and meals covered. It's not charity. She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. Why would you offer that to a woman you found standing in the road? She asked. 'Cause you've been standing at this station since 11 in the morning, and you didn't cry, he said. Came out matter of fact, not like a compliment, just an observation. Because you got on your knees in the mud and packed your own suitcase without asking anyone for anything. I need someone practical, more than I need someone impressive. Wind cut across the street. Molly pressed closer to her side. Vivian thought about the hotel, $14.60. Town, with no boarding house, nothing to recommend it to a woman without connections. She thought about what it meant to owe a man something in a place where she knew no one, where there was no one to see if a promise was broken. She also thought about the fact that she had a daughter, and the daughter was cold, and the temperature was going to drop another 10 degrees before morning. What are the terms? she said. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. Not warmth, exactly. More like relief that she'd asked the right question. Room and board for you and the girl. $12 a month, paid on the first. You manage the house, the supply ordering, and the domestic accounts. You work whatever hours the work requires. But you're not a field hand, and I won't treat you like one. And if it doesn't work, then you give me 2 weeks' notice, and I give you 2 weeks' pay, and you go wherever you go. Nah. She stood there with her broken-latched suitcase and her 5-year-old daughter and a man she'd spoken to for 10 minutes in the road, and she did the only kind of math that mattered in moments like this. The math of what she had versus what she was being offered, and whether the risk on one side outweighed the certainty of nothing on the other. All right, she said, we'll try it. He nodded, walked back to the wagon, lifted her suitcase into the back without being asked, which she noted, because it told her something about the kind of help he offered, quiet, without ceremony, not waiting for permission or gratitude. Gamali climbed up into the wagon and looked around with enormous eyes. Is this your farm, she asked. Ranch, he corrected. Farm's different. What's different about it? Farms grow things. Ranches raise things. Molly considered this. What do you raise? Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Do the horses have names? Some of them. What's that one's name? She pointed at the near horse. Sergeant? Molly looked at the horse with profound respect. That's a good name, she said. Nathan Whitmore said nothing, but something in his shoulders that had been held tightly for longer than Vivian could know, released by a fraction of an inch. Vivian climbed up beside her daughter, settled herself, and did not look back at the station as they pulled away. She would not allow herself to feel what was underneath all of this yet. The anger, the humiliation, the specific grief of having been foolish enough to trust a stranger's letters and pack her child into a train car and cross a country on the strength of ink on paper. There would be time for that later, in private, when Molly was asleep and she could sit with it in whatever room Nathan Whitmore was about to provide. Right now there was a wagon moving north on a rutted road, and cold air that smelled of coming snow, and her daughter asking a rancher about his horses with a kind of relentless curiosity that had always been the best and most exhausting part of being Molly Ashford's mother. Right now, that was enough. Double W sat on high ground, which Vivian understood was intentional the moment she saw it a man building a ranch in frontier country chose elevation because it gave him sight lines, because it let him see what was coming before it arrived. Main house was large by frontier standards, 2 full stories with a covered porch running its length, solidly built, which meant Nathan Whitmore had not been exaggerating when he described the operation. She also saw, before she'd stepped off the wagon, 3 things that told her the ranch was in quiet trouble. The firewood stacked on the south side of the house was stacked carelessly, the outer rows leaning, which meant someone had been pulling from it without restacking properly, and there would be wet wood before winter was out. The south window on the ground floor had a gap in the frame that someone had stuffed with cloth instead of repairing, which was a cold draft and a fire risk. Nah. And there were 6 ranch hands visible from where she sat, and 2 of them were standing near the stable, doing nothing, with a kind of studied casualness that meant they'd been standing there for a while. Idle men cost money. Leaking houses cost more. She didn't say any of this. She climbed down from the wagon, took Molly's hand, and waited for Nathan to show her where they'd be staying. He introduced her that evening to the 4 people who ran the house in whatever fashion it was currently being run. A cook named Bess Cullen, who was competent with food and openly suspicious of anyone new. A young man named Dory, who handled supplies and errands, and seemed cheerfully overwhelmed by both. 2 older ranch hands named Pitt and Caleb, who drifted in and out of the kitchen in the way of men who don't quite belong inside, but haven't fully committed to being outside either. Bess looked at Vivian, the way women who've been running something alone for too long look at anyone brought in to change it. Level, guarded, already preparing for a fight. I heard you're managing accounts, Bess said. First thing she said. Not hello. Among other things, Vivian said. I handle the kitchen supply list. Then I'll want to go over it with you. Not to change it, to understand it. Bess studied her. Nathan said you came west as a mail-order bride. That's right. Didn't work out. Apparently not. So he brought you here. He offered me work. I accepted it. Bess was quiet for a moment. You cook adequately. Better than I let on when I need to be. Something shifted in Bess's expression. Not approval, not yet, but interest, like she was revising her calculations slightly upward. I'll make supper. You can take stock of the pantry if you want to be useful. Vivian was already moving toward the pantry. What she found there should have been worse, but it was also clarifying. Supplies were not badly chosen. Bess knew what a working ranch needed, but the organization was chaos, and chaos in a pantry meant duplication and waste. She found 3 tins of the same lard, 2 of them already opened and going rancid. She found coffee beans stored beside lamp oil, which was going to ruin both. She found a ledger tucked on the bottom shelf that was supposed to track incoming supplies, but had last been written in sometime in August. She carried the ledger to the kitchen table and sat with it and a candle and went through it carefully, while Molly ate her supper at the other end of the table and told Bess, unprompted, about every horse she had seen from the wagon window. Numbers were not catastrophic, but they were drifting. Kind of drift that doesn't feel dangerous until it has been going on long enough that you look up and realize you've gone somewhere you didn't intend. The ranch was spending more than it needed to in small ways that added up, paying slightly above rate for certain supplies because no one had compared prices recently. Replacing tools that could have been repaired. Running a payroll that didn't quite match the productive hours being logged, though she'd need more information before she could say that clearly. She made notes in the margins of the ledger in her careful small handwriting. She did not show anyone the notes that night. It was not her ranch. She was here 11 hours. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she said a word. Sitting in the kitchen with the ledger and the candle and her daughter's voice in the background, telling Bess about Sergeant, the horse's excellent name, Vivian Ashford felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt useful, not needed the way she'd been needed while her husband was dying, which was the desperate, exhausted useful of emergency, of holding things together through sheer will because there was no alternative. Was different. This was the particular alertness of a mind that had been given a real problem to work on terms that told a story if you read them right. Gaps in a system that could be filled if you understood the system. Her late husband had let her manage the accounts from the beginning, which was unusual and which she'd never taken for granted. She had understood business the way some people understood music, not as something she'd had to learn, exactly, but as something that made a particular kind of sense to her that not everyone shared. She had been 2 years without that. It was not the reason she'd accepted Nathan Whitmore's offer. Reasons she'd accepted were practical and immediate and primarily involved keeping her daughter warm. Sitting in this kitchen with this ledger and this problem, she understood that there might be something here worth staying, for even beyond the immediate necessity. Molly fell asleep at the table. Vivian carried her to the small room. Nathan had shown them not large, but clean, with a window and 2 narrow beds and a rag rug between them, and tucked her in and stood in the dark for a moment listening to her daughter breathe. She had been so frightened this morning. In the mud, gathering her dresses, she had pressed her fear down hard enough that it made her back ache. She had not let it show because Molly was watching, and Molly's face tracked Vivian's face the way a compass tracks north, and she could not afford for her daughter to see the compass spin. But in the dark alone, she let herself feel it for a moment. The anger at Thomas Aldine, whoever and wherever he was. The shame of having been so thoroughly fooled. The fear still present, not gone, just relocated about whether she'd made the right choice climbing into a stranger's wagon. Then she put it away. She went back to the kitchen. She picked up the ledger. She lit the candle again. She had work to do. She had been sitting there perhaps another half hour when she heard boots on the porch, and Nathan Whitmore came in through the back, stamping mud from his boots, and stopped when he saw her at the table. "Sleep," he said. "I will. I wanted to finish this." Looked at the ledger, at the margins full of her notes. Crossed the kitchen, poured himself water from the pitcher, and stood by the counter. "Find anything interesting?" "A few things. I'd rather look at everything before I form opinions." "Careful." "That's accurate," she said. "Opinions formed too early tend to stick even when the evidence changes." He was quiet for a moment. "The supply situation's been a mess since August." "I know that. Since August's when this ledger stopped being maintained," she said. "What happened in August?" Something moved across his face. Not quite reluctance. More like the expression of someone shifting weight from one foot to another, deciding how much of a thing to put down. "I had someone managing the accounts. She left." "She?" "My wife," he said. Then, before Vivian could respond, "She left in July, actually. Things got disorganized in August." The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian looked at the ledger, then back at him. He was not asking her for sympathy, and his expression made clear he wasn't going to receive any. He didn't ask for, which she understood and respected. "I'll need the past year's invoices if there are any," she said. Anything related to the cattle accounts, sales records, grazing agreements, anything in writing. He studied her. You know cattle accounts? I know accounts. Cattle or dry goods or farm equipment, the principles are the same. He was quiet again. Then he walked to a cabinet near the window, pulled out a box that was clearly something between a filing system and a disaster, and set it on the table in front of her. Invoices are in there, he said. Receipts too, mostly. Some of it's not in order. She looked at the box. I can see that. Tomorrow's soon enough for that. I know. I was just looking. He picked up the candle and moved it slightly so the light fell better on the table. She hadn't asked him to do that either. The rooms are all right, he said. For you and the girl? They're fine. Thank you. Her name's Molly? Molly, yes. How old is she? 5. A pause. She'll want to see the horses in the morning. Fair warning. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite. An acknowledgement. Sergeant's better with children than he is with adults. Always has been. She'll be pleased to hear that. Put the water cup down, said goodnight, and left. Vivian sat in the kitchen with the ledger and the box of invoices and the candle, and she listened to the wind come in off the open country and press itself against the windows. She felt the day settle into her bones, all of it. Station and the mud and the wagon and this kitchen, and she thought about what it meant to have traveled all this way and arrived at nothing, and then, somehow, been offered something else. Not what she'd planned, not what she'd wanted, but real. Pulled the first invoice out of the box. She went to work. What she did not know yet, what none of them knew, was that somewhere to the east, in an office in a town a day's ride away, a man named Victor Rourke was looking at a map of the land around Millhaven and drawing a small circle around the section that included the Double W Ranch. Well, he had been watching Nathan Whitmore's property for 6 months. He was a patient man. Patient men won more often than they lost, in his experience, because desperation had a way of finding people eventually. Desperate people made decisions that patient men could profit from. He didn't know yet about the woman Nathan Whitmore had brought back from the train station. Refine thought it out soon enough, and by then it would already be too late to account for her. The first invoice Vivian pulled from Nathan's box was dated March of the previous year, and it was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announced itself. Quiet kind, a supply order for fence post materials, billed at a rate that was 11 cents per unit above the going price she'd seen reflected in 3 other invoices from the same period. 11 cents. On 400 units. $44 gone to a supplier who had apparently decided that a busy ranch owner wouldn't notice the difference. She set it to one side. She kept pulling. By the time the candle had burned down 2 inches, she had a small separate stack of invoices that didn't sit right. Not all of them were clear errors. Some of them were judgment calls, purchases she didn't have enough context to fully evaluate yet. But the pattern underneath them was starting to take a shape, and shapes were what she was good at reading. She went to bed just before midnight, leaving the box organized and the ledger open to the page where she'd stopped. In the morning, Molly woke before her and got halfway down the stairs before Vivian heard her, which meant by the time Vivian caught up, she found her daughter already in the kitchen, sitting at the table across from Bess Cullen, eating a bowl of oats like she'd been eating breakfast at the Double W her entire life. Bess was watching her with the expression of someone who had decided, reluctantly, that this particular child was tolerable. She asked if Sergeant would still be awake, Bess said when Vivian appeared in the doorway. I told her horses don't sleep like people do. He sleeps standing up, Molly said. Bess told me. It is strange, Vivian agreed. She poured herself coffee and stood at the counter and drank it and felt the previous day rearrange itself into something she could carry. Nathan came in from outside about 20 minutes later, already having been out for what looked like 2 hours. Mud on his boots, the look about him of a man who had covered ground before most people had opened their eyes. Poured coffee, drank half of it standing up, and looked at the organized table where Vivian had left the ledger and the box. Sorted all of that, he said. Most of it. I have questions. After breakfast, they ate in a kind of utilitarian quiet that Vivian found she didn't mind. Ranch kitchens had a rhythm she recognized from the early years of her marriage, when there had been more work than words, and the work itself was a kind of conversation. Bess put food on the table. Everyone ate it. No one performed. After Molly had been sent outside with strict instructions to look at Sergeant through the fence and not open any gate, Vivian spread 3 invoices on the cleared table in front of Nathan and pointed to the figures she'd circled. Supplier for hardware materials has been billing you above rate for at least 8 months, she said. Not by a lot per unit, but on the volume you're ordering, it's significant. I'd estimate you've overpaid by close to $200 in that period. Nathan looked at the invoices. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes went still and focused the way a man's does when he's recalculating something he thought he already understood. Harkins has been supplying this ranch for 6 years. I know, which is probably why he assumed you'd stop checking. Silence. What else? She showed him the labor ledger discrepancy next 3 names appearing on the payroll for days they didn't appear in any of the work logs she'd found in the same box. Not a lot of days, but consistent, month after month, kind of pattern that required either negligence or intent on someone's part. She wasn't prepared to say which yet. Nathan was quiet for a longer time with this one. Dory keeps the work logs, he said. I know. I'm not saying Dory's the problem. I'm saying there's a gap, and it needs explaining. Dory's been with me 4 years. Then he'll be able to explain it. She paused. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here to tell you what the numbers say, and the numbers say something's been wrong for a while. What you do with that is your business. Nathan looked at her across the table. Morning light came through the window and hit the side of his face, and she could see the tension in his jaw, not anger at her, she thought, but the particular tension of a man who suspects he's been handled and is trying to figure out for how long. $200, he said. At minimum. He pushed back from the table and stood. I'll talk Tarkin's in town this week. There's something else, she said. Stopped. She had debated whether to mention this yet. It was the thing she was least sure about, the thing that could be entirely innocent or could be something considerably worse. She was aware that she'd been at this ranch for less than 24 hours, and walking in with accusations was a fast way to end a working arrangement before it began. But she'd lain awake thinking about it after she'd gone to bed, and she'd decided that staying quiet about something that might matter was worse than mentioning it too soon. Survey documents in the back of the box, she said. One's related to the northern pasture boundary. The land survey, there are 2 of them. They don't match. Pause. What do you mean they don't match? I mean the boundary line described in the older document and the boundary line described in the newer one are different by about 40 feet along the creek edge. Maybe a drafting error. Surveys get redrawn. But the newer document has a filing date from 14 months ago, which means someone commissioned a new survey in the past year and a half, and the new survey happens to shrink your water access on the northern creek side. Nathan stood very still. I didn't know there was a second survey, he said. Then you should probably find out who commissioned it, Vivian said. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Molly standing at the fence with her arms hooked over the top rail, watching Sargent with the intense focus of a child who has decided she is going to understand something completely. The horse stood about 4 feet away, not approaching, but not moving off either, studying each other, the 5-year-old and the horse, with equivalent gravity. Nathan followed her gaze. Something in his face relaxed fractionally, the way it does when you look at something uncomplicated in the middle of a complicated morning. She's not afraid of much, he said. No, Vivian said. She generally isn't. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I'll want to sit down with you tonight and go through all of it. Properly, I'll be ready. He went out. The door didn't slam, he closed it the same way he seemed to do most things, with a controlled and practical care that she suspected cost him more than it looked like. Vivian poured herself a second cup of coffee and stood by the window and thought about a survey document that shrank a ranch's water access, and a filing date of 14 months ago, and a man named Victor Rourke who had supposedly been making offers on the northern pasture. She thought about these things quietly and carefully, the way she'd learned to think about things that scared her, not looking away, but not running toward them either, just holding them steady until they showed her their shape. Week that followed was the kind that reveals character, not in a single dramatic moment, but in accumulation. Daily arithmetic of small choices. Vivian had expected resistance. She'd braced for it the way she braced for most things, by identifying where it would likely come from and preparing for it specifically. Bess, she'd expected to be difficult. Dory, she'd thought, might be defensive about the work logs. Ranch hands had looked at her arrival the way men in physical labor often look at someone who arrives with an accounting ledger, like a school teacher walking into a card game. What she hadn't expected was how quickly usefulness could override suspicion. She reorganized the pantry on the second day. Not dramatically, she didn't throw things out or rearrange anything beyond what common sense dictated. She separated the dry goods by frequency of use, She moved the lamp oil to the shed where it belonged. She found the rancid lard and replaced it from the supply she found in the wrong cabinet, and the total effective food supply in the kitchen went up without spending $1. Bess watched all of this from her position at the stove, with the expression of someone watching a card player reveal a hand they'd suspected was good. "Flour barrel's in the wrong place," Bess said on the third morning. "I know," Vivian said. "I didn't want to move it without asking." Bess was quiet. "Then move it to the left wall. The right side gets a draft from the window. Makes everything damp." "I'll do it today." They worked around each other in the kitchen after that with something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite partnership, but was functional and honest, which was often more useful than either. Dory, for his part, turned out to be not dishonest but genuinely overwhelmed. When Vivian sat down with him and the work logs and walked through the discrepancies carefully and without accusation, he went pale with something that was clearly embarrassment rather than guilt. He'd been keeping 2 separate logs and forgetting to transfer between them. 3 names had gotten listed on payroll days when they'd technically been working on a task he'd categorized separately. It was a mess, not a scheme, and it had cost the ranch money through pure organizational chaos rather than intent. "I should have caught this," he said. "The system you inherited wasn't designed to catch it," Vivian said. "We'll build a better one." He looked at her with the gratitude of someone who had been waiting to be yelled at and hadn't been. She put him in charge of a new logging system she designed that afternoon, gave him clear templates and explicit instructions, and made herself available to answer questions. By the end of the week, the supply records were 3 days more current than they'd been in months. Ranch hands took longer. Not hostile, most of them. Just distant in the way men are with a new arrival they're still deciding about. Where 9 of them total 6 long-term hands, and 3 seasonal workers who'd stayed on through winter because the pay was fair and the weather was bad. They ate in the bunkhouse mostly, came to the main kitchen for supplies, and occasionally for Bess's cooking when she made something that drifted appetizingly through the cold air. Pitt and Caleb were the exception. They ate in the main kitchen most mornings, a habit so established that no one seemed to remember when it had started. Pitt was in his 60s with a bad knee and the kind of slow, steady competence that comes from having done hard work for a very long time. Caleb was younger by about a decade, but had the same quality of stillness, of movement that didn't waste itself. Molly adopted them. There was no other word for it. By the end of the first week, she appeared at Pitt's side after breakfast with the regularity of a schedule, and Pitt bore this with the stoic resignation of a man who had been claimed by a 5-year-old before and knew there was no graceful exit. He answered her questions about horses. He showed her how the lasso worked. Let her watch him repair fence posts with the focused attention of a small person learning a craft. Caleb taught her to whistle. It took 3 days. She got it on the afternoon of the 4th. Vivian watched all of this from whatever she was doing and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Ohio. Molly had not had steady people around her in 2 years. She'd had Vivian, who was a good mother but was also a mother in crisis, a mother managing grief and practical disaster simultaneously, moving through spaces and not having room to stay. The thing Molly had needed and not had was continuity, a sense that the adults around her would still be there tomorrow. Pitt and Caleb showed up every morning. That was enough. It was more than enough. On the 8th day, Victor Rourke came to the ranch. Vivian was in the study Nathan had given her use of the small room off the main hall to work in, a room with a desk and a window, and enough space for the organized filing system she'd been building when she heard the wagon on the drive. She looked out the window and saw a man she didn't recognize climb down, well-dressed by frontier standards, which meant his coat was good-quality wool, and his boots weren't working boots. He had the kind of face that looked pleasant at first assessment, the features arranged in a way that suggested sociability and approachability, and she'd known enough men with faces like that to understand they were often the most careful faces to read. Stayed as in the study. She wasn't going to insert herself into a business meeting she hadn't been introduced to. She left the door open, and she listened. She could hear Nathan's voice from the front room, and then the other voice, confident, warm. Cadence of a man who spent considerable time persuading people of things. She caught fragments. Northern water rights, seasonal flooding, fair price, market conditions in the Eastern Territories. Name Aldine came up once briefly, in a way she couldn't quite hear the context of. Then Nathan's voice, even, "I've told you before, Rourke. Pasture's not for sale," and Rourke's voice, "Still pleasant, I understand. I just want you to know the offer stands, and I'd encourage you to think about the survey situation before the spring thaw. Flood seasons on that creek have been getting worse. Don't want to be managing a water dispute on top of everything else. Pause. I'll keep that in mind, Nathan said. She heard the meeting end, heard boots cross the hall, heard the front door. She looked out the window again and watched Victor Rourke climb back into his wagon. He moved without hurry. He didn't look back at the house. Nathan appeared in the doorway of the study a few minutes later. Looked at her. You heard some of it. The walls are thin. Gah. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, which she'd noticed was how he stood when he was thinking something through rather than just feeling it. He's been coming around every few months for the past year. Always pleasant, always the same pitch. What did he mean about the survey situation? She said. Nathan was quiet. He knows about the second survey, she said. It wasn't a question. He commissioned it. Nathan said it flat, like he'd been sitting on this and had decided to put it down. I found that out 2 months ago. Someone in the county office mentioned it in passing. He didn't announce it. He just quietly had someone resurvey my northern boundary and filed the new document. He can't do that without your. He did it through a process that's technically legal if you have the right contact in the county records office. The document was filed under a land dispute provision that allows a neighboring property holder to request a boundary review. He's not the neighboring property holder, but he has a financial interest in the land company that owns the property east of mine. Filed it on his behalf. Vivian sat with this for a moment. Shrank your water access, she said, on paper. And when spring flooding hits and the creek shifts. On paper, my cattle are accessing water on land that's in dispute. He said it with the flatness of a man who has thought through something until it stopped scaring him and started just making him angry. He's been doing this to other ranches. I heard about 2 others over the winter. Small operations, both of them. Both ended up selling to a land company at about 60 cents on the dollar because they couldn't afford the legal fight. And you? I can afford a legal fight. But it takes time. And meanwhile, I've got a survey document on file that creates problems for any cattle financing I need this spring. He looked at her. I wasn't going to tell you this yet. Why not? Because you've been here a week and I didn't want to. He stopped. Started again. I hired you to manage the house. Not to carry this. I'm not carrying it, she said. I'm asking about it because it affects the accounts, and the accounts are my job. She looked at the desk in front of her, the organized files. Boundary dispute will need documentation. Every piece of paper that establishes historical water usage on that pasture needs to be found and organized. Cattle watering logs, grazing records, anything that shows long-standing use before that survey was filed. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. I can do that, she said, if you tell me where to look. Quiet for a moment. There are older ranch records in the attic. Some of them go back to when my father started this place. Then I'll need to go through them. He pushed off the doorframe. She started to say something and didn't. Then he said, you should know that Rourke is well connected in this county. People he has in the county records office aren't the only ones. I assumed, and whoever he had commissioned that survey. I know, she said. It means the problem isn't just paperwork. Means there are people in official positions helping him. Yes. She looked out the window at the empty drive where Rourke's wagon had been. Kind of man is he? The kind that doesn't get caught, Nathan said. Because he never does anything directly. She nodded slowly. Then we need to build something he can't step around. She turned back to the desk. Start with the attic records. Can you bring them down? Did. 3 wooden boxes, dusty and heavy, came down from the attic that afternoon. Vivian put them in the study and went through them with the same care she'd given the invoice box, pulling everything related to water usage, grazing rights, boundary references, and land transactions. Some of the documents went back 20 years, written in Nathan's father's hand, a man who had apparently kept meticulous records, who had noted every negotiation and agreement with a clarity that his son had either inherited or learned. She organized them chronologically. She cross-referenced them against the 2 survey documents. She made a list of every recorded instance of W cattle accessing the Northern Creek in the historical record, which turned out to be extensive and continuous and thoroughly documented. By evening, she had something that looked, to her non-legal eye, like a very solid foundation for an argument that the boundary described in the newer survey document was inconsistent with 20 years of established and recorded use. She was not a lawyer. She could not file anything or argue anything in a county office. But she could put together a package of evidence clear enough that a lawyer could work with it. She was halfway through writing a summary when the knock came at the study door. Pitt. He was holding his hat in his hands, which meant this was something deliberate, not casual. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Ashford. You got a minute?" "Of course." He came in, looked at the papers on the desk, looked at her. "You know about the boundary thing. I've been looking at the documents." He was quiet for a moment. Old men who have worked land for a long time have a particular relationship with silence. They use it the way other people use words. Rourke had a man come out about 6 weeks ago. Said he was doing a wildlife survey. Walked the northern fence line for 2 days. She looked at him. "Nathan know about this?" I told him. He said it was probably nothing. "What did you think?" Pitt looked at his hat. "I thought the man paid more attention to the fence posts than to any wildlife." He looked up. Took photographs. Had one of those box cameras. Spent a lot of time at the section where the fence meets the creek marker. Vivian thought about this carefully. A man photographing the fence and the creek marker in the context of a filed survey dispute. He was documenting the current fence position, she said, relative to the new survey line. "That's what I figured," Pitt said. "Didn't know if it mattered." "It matters," she said. "Do you know when exactly?" "The date he was out there?" "First week of February. I remember because it was the week after the cold snap." She wrote it down. First week of February. Rourke's man surveying the fence line after the new boundary document was already filed. Building a case. "Thank you, Pitt," she said. He put his hat back on. Nodded once. "That man Rourke." He paused. "He came to talk to my brother's neighbor 2 winters ago. Small cattle operation. By spring, the man had sold and moved his family east." He looked at her steadily. "I've been working this ranch for 9 years. I'd like to keep working it." "I understand," she said. He went out. She sat at the desk and thought about Rourke's man with a box camera, then the filed survey document, the 2 ranches that had already sold at 60 cents on the dollar. GUP and what the pattern looked like when you drew a line through it. Looked like a man who had found a method that worked and was working it systematically. It looked like he'd been working it on the double W for longer than anyone had realized. She went back to the documents. 2 days later, she found what she hadn't expected to find. Buried in the oldest box of records, in a paper that had gotten tucked into the wrong folder sometime in the past decade, was an agreement handwritten, signed by Nathan's father and a neighboring property holder that established a shared water usage right on the northern creek, predating any of the surveys by 15 years. Agreement was specific, clear, and included a clause that stated the water access rights were attached to the land itself and not subject to revision without the consent of both original parties. Both original parties were deceased, but their heirs held the land. Nathan held one side. The property on the other side, the one now held by the land company with the financial interest. Victor Rourke sat behind, held the other. The land company had never acknowledged this agreement, never sought consent to revise the water rights, filed a new survey as though the agreement didn't exist. The agreement was legally valid, and Vivian did not know enough law to say for certain, then the new survey was not just questionable. It was potentially built on a fraudulent foundation. She sat very still with the document in her hands. This was not a matter of organizing papers anymore. She found Nathan in the barn at the end of the day, doing the last equipment check before supper, the way he did every evening, moving through the space with an unhurried thoroughness she'd come to recognize as just how he moved through all things. "I need you to read something," she said. He looked at her face and put down what he was holding without being asked. She gave him the agreement. He read it twice. She watched his expression move from focused to still to something that looked like controlled anger. "My father never mentioned this," he said. "Do you think he forgot about it, or didn't forget things?" Nathan looked at the document again. "I think he didn't think it needed mentioning because it was filed, because he assumed it was known. The question is whether the land company that now owns the other parcel knew about it when they filed the survey." Nathan looked at her. "If they did," she said, "then the survey isn't a miscalculation. It's fraud." The word sat between them. It was not a word either of them said lightly, and neither of them moved to take it back. "I need an attorney," Nathan said. "You need the right attorney," she said. "Ah, not someone connected to the county office." He was already thinking. She could see it running through names, running through what he knew about who could be trusted in a county where at least one official had already been turned. "There's a man in Calford, 3 hours east. Harlan Greer. Retired from the territory bar, but still takes cases he considers worth taking." He paused. "Doesn't like land companies. Can you reach him?" "I can ride out there the day after tomorrow." "Take this." she said, meaning the agreement. Take the summary I've been writing. I'll have it finished tomorrow. Took the document and folded it with care. You found this in the attic boxes. In the wrong folder. It's been mislaid for probably 10 years. He looked at her with something she didn't quite have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, because he wasn't a man who performed gratitude. More like the recalibration she'd seen in his eyes that first morning when she'd shown him the invoices, the look of a man updating his understanding of what was in front of him. I hired you to manage the pantry, he said. The pantry's managed, she said. I had extra time. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. She went back to the study. She wrote until midnight. Summary was 12 pages. Laid out every relevant document in chronological order, every discrepancy between the surveys, every historical usage record she'd found, Pitt's account of Rourke's man with the camera. At the end, she wrote a clear statement of the central finding. That a water rights agreement predating all subsequent surveys had apparently not been acknowledged in any land transaction involving the eastern parcel, and that this omission may have material bearing on the validity of the recently filed boundary revision. She wrote it the way her late husband had taught her to write business documents, plainly, without embellishment, every claim traceable to a specific piece of evidence. No more than what the evidence supported, no less. She set it on the desk. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, listening to the house settle around her the creak of old wood, distant sound of wind against the north windows, somewhere upstairs, the small even breathing of a child who had gone to sleep without nightmares for the 6th night in a row. She had arrived at this ranch with a broken suitcase and a daughter, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being let down by something you allowed yourself to trust. She had arrived with nothing except the ability to read numbers and recognize patterns, and refused to look away from things that scared her. She did not know yet what Victor Rourke was capable of when pushed. She did not know what the attorney in Calford would say, or whether the agreement she'd found would hold up under legal scrutiny, or whether the people Rourke had in the county records office extended further than anyone yet knew. She knew that the Double W was a real thing 60 years of her father-in-law's records, 9 years of Pitt's mornings, Molly's new skill at whistling, Sargent's particular patience with small children, and that it was being taken apart quietly by a man who had decided that other people's desperation was a business opportunity. Pressed both hands flat on the 12 pages she'd written. She was not going to let that stand. Nathan left for Calford before dawn. Vivian heard him go the particular quiet of a man trying not to wake a house, boots on the back steps, the low sound of a horse being taken from the stable. She lay in the dark for a moment, listening to it, then got up and went to the window and watched the lantern light move down the drive and disappear into the black. She had given him the summary and the original water rights agreement, both wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, when she had gone through the key points with him the night before, until she was confident he could explain them to Harlan Greer without losing the thread. He was not a man who needed things repeated. She'd learned that quickly. Said something once and he filed it, and when he retrieved it later, he retrieved it accurately. What she had not told him was how uncertain she still was. The water rights agreement was real. The document was genuine. She was certain of that. The paper and ink consistent with its dated date, the handwriting matching Nathan's father's hand in other documents she'd cross-referenced. But whether it was legally binding after 15 years of dormancy, through 2 property transfers on the eastern parcel, in a county where at least one records official was already working against them that she didn't know. She was not a lawyer, and she had never pretended to be one. What she knew was numbers and patterns, and the pattern she was looking at had Victor Rourke at its center, working outward. She made coffee. She went to the study. She spent the morning building a second document she hadn't told Nathan about yet, a timeline. Not of the water rights dispute specifically, but of every ranch sale in the county she could find referenced in the newspapers. Nathan kept bundled in the attic. Every land transaction she could trace to the same Eastern Territories land company. Every appearance of a name connected to Rourke in any context she could locate. She used the newspapers, the invoices, her own notes from the past 2 weeks. In a directory of county land holdings she'd found wedged behind the oldest box of records. What emerged was slower and less complete than she wanted. She was working from fragments, but the shape was there. 4 properties in 3 years, all of them with some form of land or water access dispute that appeared just before the sale. All of them sold to different purchasing names that Vivian traced, through 2 and sometimes 3 layers of business designation back to the same parent company. All of them sold at significantly below assessed value. Method was elegant in the way that purely predatory things sometimes are. Rourke didn't buy land. He manufactured the conditions under which people gave it up. Found a legal pressure point, a boundary question, the water access dispute, debt instrument he could quietly acquire from a struggling creditor, and he applied it steadily until the owner ran out of money or will or both. And then someone connected to him arrived with a reasonable offer at an unreasonable price, and the exhausted owner took it because the alternative was worse. Patient, he was thorough, and he had people inside the county structure who ensured that the legal mechanisms he used were available when he needed them. She stared at the timeline. 4 ranches. The double W would be the 5th. She heard Molly's feet on the stairs, the particular 2-footed stomp of a 5-year-old descending at speed, and put the timeline face down on the desk before her daughter appeared in the doorway. "Nathan back?" Molly asked. "Not yet. He'll be gone a few days." Molly considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing information that mattered. Where did he go? To see a man about some paperwork. Boring paperwork or important paperwork? Important. Molly nodded, apparently satisfied with this distinction. Pitt said I can watch him shoe a horse today if I stand behind the line. Behind the line means behind the line, Vivian said. Not near the line, not at the line. I know, Mama. Horses kick without. I know. Molly was already heading toward the kitchen with the direction of someone who had a full schedule. Bess is making eggs. Vivian listened to her go and felt the familiar compression in her chest that came with loving someone this much, the way it sat alongside the fear of the world the child had to live in, inseparable, both of them always present. She turned the timeline back over. She had 3 days before Nathan returned, if the weather held. She was going to use them. The weather did not hold. Started on the 2nd day, a gray settling of the sky that Pitt read correctly at breakfast and said nothing about, except to Caleb, in a low voice that Vivian caught the edge of, north clouds stacking. By tonight turned out to be generous. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees and the light had gone the particular flat white of a sky preparing for something serious. Vivian found herself checking the window every hour, not because she was worried about Nathan on the road he'd have made Calford by now and would shelter there if the weather turned bad. It was not a man who rode into storms for pride's sake, but because something in the quality of the cold felt different from the cold of the past weeks. Pitt confirmed it at supper. "Creek'll run high if this hits the way I think it will," he said. "We had the same kind of sky 2 winters back. Lost fence line along the north pasture." Vivian looked at him. "The north pasture boundary. Along the creek?" "Yes, ma'am." He was buttering bread with the calm of a man reporting weather to someone who ought to know it. "When the water rises, it pushes through the lower fence section. We've patched it 3 times. The ground's too soft to hold posts properly in that section." North pasture boundary. The same section where Rourke's man had stood with his camera in February. Same creek that the false survey had redrawn to compress Nathan's water access. "What happens to the cattle when the fence goes?" she asked. "Drift," Caleb said. "Some of them know to stay on high ground. Young ones don't always." He paused. "In a bad storm, they'll push toward the creek for water, and then the current's too strong and—" He stopped, glanced at Molly, adjusted. "It's not good. How many cattle are we talking about?" "North pasture's running about 60 head right now," Pitt said. "Nathan rotated the larger herd south 2 weeks ago. Lucky, as it turns out, 60 head. At current market prices, a significant loss if the storm hit hard and the fence failed. More significantly, if any cattle ended up on the disputed creek side of the boundary during a flooding event, Rourke's legal team would have documentation of double W cattle on contested land. Or another pressure point created, this time by weather. She didn't know if Rourke had anticipated this. She suspected he hadn't the man planned carefully, but he didn't control weather. He would certainly use it if it happened. "How long would it take to move the north pasture cattle to safer ground?" she asked. Pitt and Caleb looked at each other. "Couple hours in good conditions," Pitt said. "What's coming?" He looked at the window. "Longer." "Then we should start before it gets worse," she said. Both men looked at her. "Nathan's not back," Caleb said. "Not challenging her, just stating the fact on the table." "I know." She looked at them both steadily. "I'm not telling you what to do. You know this ranch better than I do. I'm telling you what I see in the numbers, and what it would mean if those cattle end up on the wrong side of that fence in a flooding event." She paused. "You make the call." Another look between them. something passing in it that was the shorthand of men who have worked alongside each other long enough to conduct whole conversations in a glance. Pitt pushed back from the table. I'll get the other hands. Vivian was already standing. I'll come. Both men looked at her again. This time was something different in it. Mrs. Ashford, Caleb started. I can ride, she said, not impressively. But I can stay on a horse in bad weather, and I can follow instruction. You'll need every person you have out there. Another silence. Pitt put on his hat. You'll need a heavier coat. I have one. She did have one, barely. The coat she'd worn from Ohio was wool and long and had been adequate against Ohio winter, which was a different proposition from frontier winter on horseback in deteriorating weather. It was what she had, and she wasn't going to spend time she didn't have cataloging inadequacies. She checked on Molly, found her already asleep. The child could sleep through considerable noise. Once she went down, a gift Vivian was grateful for, and left Bess with instructions. Bess looked at her coat, and her expression said everything she chose not to say out loud, then went to the hook by the back door and pulled down a heavy canvas duster that had been hanging there since August. That was my husband's, Bess said. He was taller than you. Little drag. She helped Vivian into it. Don't fall off the horse. I wasn't planning to, Vivian said. Nobody plans it. Outside, the air hit her face like something physical. Temperature had dropped again in the past hour, and the sky was fully committed now. No stars, no moon, a solid dark that moved at the edges where the clouds were still coming in. 4 of the ranch hands were already mounted. Pitt and Caleb were pulling on gloves by the stable door. Dory appeared from the bunkhouse at a run, cramming his hat down. Pitt looked at her on the horse, one of Nathan's working horses, a steady gray she'd ridden twice in the past week at Molly's insistence, and gave her a single nod. They rode out. The north pasture was a 20-minute ride in normal conditions. It took them closer to 40, moving against the wind that had picked up seriously now, carrying the first hard particles of sleet that stung against any exposed skin. Vivian kept her head down, and her hands sure on the reins, and did not think about how cold she was, because thinking about it would not make her warmer. Pasture, when they reached it, was already showing signs. Creek, which she'd only seen at a low winter trickle, had come up noticeably in the past few hours. It wasn't flooding yet. The sound of it was different, fuller, faster, a sound with weight behind it. Cattle were clustered in the low section near the southern fence, which was the wrong direction. They've already moved toward the water, Caleb said, pulling up beside her. Can we push them north, she asked. In this? They'll split on us. He looked at the herd, calculating. We need to get them moving fast before the creek gets any louder, or they'll panic. Hands spread without being told, the particular efficiency of people who have done this before and know what their role is without discussion. Vivian positioned herself where Pitt directed her at the eastern flank, her job to turn any cattle that broke in that direction, which was the direction of the disputed boundary and the rising creek. She had not herded cattle before. She had ridden beside men who herded cattle in the first year of her marriage, when she'd been young and interested in everything. But that was watching, not doing. She understood was the basic geometry of it. You were trying to shape something moving. You used your position and your horse's position to create a wall the animals would move away from, and you moved that wall in the direction you needed them to go. She understood the geometry. The execution in sleet and darkness with 60 cattle who were already unsettled was a different matter. The herd began to move. It went reasonably for the first 10 minutes, the hands pushing from the south, Vivian and Dory holding the eastern flank, cattle shifting north with the particular reluctant compliance of animals who don't fully understand why they're being asked to move, but can feel the authority of horses around them. Wind was picking up steadily, and the sleet was becoming something closer to snow, thick and wet, the kind that accumulated fast. Then the creek made a sound. Not loud, exactly, but deep. The low surge that rolled through the bottom of the valley as the upstream banks gave way somewhere, and the water found more room. Cattle heard it before any of the humans did. The herd front shuddered. Vivian saw it, the collective head-raising, the sudden tension that ran through them like a current, and then the eastern edge broke. 8, maybe 10 animals split from the herd and ran directly toward the creek and the fence line. Vivian was already moving. She didn't think about it. Horse felt her weight shift and went, fast and sure in the darkness, the gray having a better sense of the ground beneath them than Vivian did. Came around the front of the breaking animals, and she pulled hard right, positioning herself between the cattle and the fence. She heard herself making sounds she'd heard cattle hands make low, firm. driving sounds, and whether it was her position or the sounds or sheer surprise at a woman in an oversized canvas duster materializing out of the dark, the cattle checked. Not all of them. 3 pushed past her and hit the fence, which held barely, the posts groaning and turned themselves back. 7 turned before the fence and milled there, confused, and Dory came up behind them, and she and Dory together pushed them back toward the herd. She was shaking by the time they rejoined the main group. She told herself it was the cold. It took another hour to get all 60 head to the high ground of the north paddock, which was far enough from the creek to be safe, even if the flooding worsened. By the time the gate was closed, everyone was soaked through. The snow was coming down hard, and the temperature had dropped enough that the wet on her coat had started going stiff. Pitt came up beside her as she was catching her breath. 3 got to the fence, he said. I know, they turned. Put yourself between them and the boundary line. It was the right position. He was quiet for a moment. In the dark, she couldn't see his face well, only the outline of him, the set of his shoulders. Fence would have given if they'd pressed it, he said. And those 3 would have been in the creek on the wrong side of the boundary line. She understood what he was saying. She understood it exactly. Let's get back, she said. They rode back in the snow, slower, the horses picking their way carefully. Vivian's hands had lost most of their feeling, but she kept them on the reins because she needed to, and because the thinking about them would not help, and she concentrated instead on the gray horse beneath her and the lights of the ranch house visible through the weather ahead. Bess met them at the stable with lanterns and what turned out to be coffee so hot it was almost painful to drink, which was exactly right. Dory took Vivian's horse without being asked. Caleb was already with the other hands. Pitt stood by the stable door a moment and looked at her, really looked. The way old men sometimes do who've seen enough to know what a moment means. Good work tonight, he said. He went inside. She stood in the cold for an extra moment. Nathan came back on the 4th day, a day later than planned, because the storm had held him in Calford, which she had counted on, and was relieved to have confirmed when she heard the horse on the drive. She was in the study when he rode in, and she gave him 20 minutes to get settled before she appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was at the table with Bess's coffee, and the look of a man who had been traveling in bad weather and was in the process of returning to himself. Looked up when she came in. Cattle, he said first. All 60 head moved to the high paddock before the storm hit. 3 pushed the east fence, they turned. Fence held. He let out a breath that had been in him since he got back on the road, she suspected. Harlan Greer, he said. Yes, she said. She sat down across from him. He read your summary. He read the agreement. Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said in 30 years of land law he'd seen manufactured boundary disputes before, but he'd never seen one built on top of an unacknowledged prior agreement. He said, if the agreement is valid and he believes it is, the language is clear, and the filing is legitimate, then the survey Rourke commissioned is legally hollow. She felt something release in her chest. Hollow how, she said. Hollow because you can't revise a boundary that's governed by a prior binding agreement without the consent of the parties to that agreement. The land company never had consent. They may not have even known the agreement existed. He paused. Greer thinks they knew. He thinks someone in the records office buried the reference. Deliberate concealment. That's what he said. She thought about this. A land company with someone inside the county records office, able to determine what documents were visible and what weren't. It was worse than she'd imagined, and she had imagined it fairly dark. What does he need? She said. He's coming here. Next week. If the road's clear. Nathan looked at her. He wants to see the original documents. He wants to talk to Pitt about Rourke's man with the camera. Pitt will talk to him. Greer also said. Nathan stopped. He was working out how to say something. She'd noticed he did this, took time with things that mattered, didn't rush them out because the words were too important to trip over. Said, the person who assembled this evidence knew what they were doing. He said whoever put together that summary understood how land law reads better than most people who don't practice it. She said nothing. He asked who your attorney was, Nathan said. I told him you were my housekeeper. A silence. He said that was a waste, Nathan said. She looked at the table. She had known. In the years of her marriage, yet her mind worked in ways that were not conventional for women of her time and place, not because she had been told this, but because she'd watched the faces of men in business meetings when she spoke. A slight recalibration, the adjustment required to hear what she was saying as legitimate because of who was saying it. She had learned to work around it, to let her husband put the conclusions in the room and provide the evidence from the side. It was not something she spent energy being bitter about. It was simply geography, the terrain as it existed, to be navigated. Greer's opinion isn't what matters right now, she said. What matters is whether we have enough to take to the county. Thinks we do. But he also said, another pause. He said, Rourke will know we're moving against him as soon as Greer files anything. And a man like Rourke, cornered, doesn't sit still. She had thought about this too in the night since she'd found the water rights agreement. She'd been thinking about what the pattern suggested about Rourke's methods when they were threatened rather than when they were proceeding smoothly. The 4 previous ranches had all sold. None of them had fought back through legal channels, which meant she didn't have evidence of what Rourke did when someone did fight back. Do you know anything about the 2 ranches that sold? She asked. Some. Did anything happen to them before they sold? Beyond the legal pressure? Nathan's expression changed slightly. Not a lot. Enough. Second, one man named Hollis ran a small cattle operation east of town. His barn caught fire about 2 months before he sold. They called it an accident. She looked at him. And the other? Linwood family. Older couple, their water well was fouled. Took them 3 weeks to trace it. He met her eyes. Fouled deliberately. They couldn't prove who. Kitchen was very quiet. Vivian thought about Molly upstairs. About Pitt and Caleb and Dory and Bess. About Sargent in the stable and 60 cattle on high ground and a ranch that had been built over 60 years by people who'd gotten up before dawn every morning because the work required it. She thought about a man who, when the thing he wanted was close enough, apparently didn't bother with subtlety. We should talk to Greer about how quickly he can file, she said. Voice was level. She made it level deliberately. I thought the same thing, Nathan said, and we should think about who else on this property could be approached. She meant it practically, not as a warning. Rourke will look for the weakest point. Anyone with a grievance or a debt. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Dory's brother owes money in town. I know that. Dory's a good hand, but he's been stressed about it. Has anyone approached Dory? Not that I know of. Someone might. He nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man who was revising his sense of how complicated this had become and deciding to revise forward rather than retreat. I'll talk to him, Nathan said, without making it an accusation. Yes, she said. That's the way. Outside, the snow from the storm had begun to melt at the edges, the particular tired dissolution of a storm that had spent itself. Water ran from the eaves. The road north would be mud for several days. She was thinking about Rourke's man with the camera, standing at the fence line in February. Documenting. Building something. A man that careful did not operate alone, and the people around him were not all going to be in county offices. Some of them were going to be closer. She was thinking about this when she heard Molly on the stairs, and then her daughter's voice in the hallway. Nathan, you're back. And Nathan's voice, which was not a warm voice by nature, but managed something in that moment that came close to it. I'm back. Did you see the storm? We moved the cows. Mama rode in the dark. Pause, did she? She was really fast, I heard. Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to this exchange and felt something she had not felt in a long time, something complicated. Not simple happiness. Not the easy version, more like the recognition of it in a thing that was becoming real, taking on weight and dimension that she had not planned for and could not quite name yet. She turned back to the kitchen. She picked up her own coffee. She had work to do. Harlan Greer arrived 7 days later on a horse that looked too small for him. He was a tall, angular man in his late 60s with a gray beard and the precise, deliberate speech of someone who had spent decades choosing words in rooms where they had legal weight. Shook Vivian's hand when Nathan introduced her, and he shook it the way he'd have shaken a colleague's, not a performance of courtesy, but a genuine greeting between people he expected to have a real conversation with. Spent 2 hours with the documents. Then he talked to Pitt. Then he sat at the kitchen table with Nathan and Vivian and a cup of Bess's coffee and said what he'd found. The agreement is valid, he said. The language is unambiguous, and the filing is traceable in the county record, despite someone's best efforts to make it difficult to find. I have a clerk in the county seat who is not connected to the Millhaven office, and she located the original filing in the territorial archive. He looked at his notes. Land company's failure to acknowledge this agreement in 2 successive property transfers constitutes, in my view, a fraudulent misrepresentation of the property's legal encumbrances. Meaning the sale to the land company was legally flawed, Vivian said. Meaning the land company acquired a property whose legal status they either didn't investigate properly or chose to misrepresent. He looked at her. Either way, it gives us the foundation for a claim. Against the land company, Nathan said. against the land company, and potentially against the official who filed the new survey document without disclosing the prior agreement. That's the element that concerns me most, not because it weakens our case, but because it suggests a level of deliberate concealment that will make certain people in the county very uncomfortable when this comes to light. Rourke's people, Nathan said. I don't have proof of Rourke's direct involvement in the filing, Greer said carefully. I have evidence of a pattern consistent with what you've described and what I've seen in the other ranch transactions. Court wants direct evidence of direct action. He set down his cup. What I can file now will stop the boundary claim and restore your water rights pending full adjudication. That's the immediate need. And the rest? Greer looked at Nathan steadily. Rest requires finding someone inside Rourke's operation who is willing to talk, or finding a document that puts his name directly on the county office contact. He paused. Those things are harder. The room was quiet. Vivian had been listening with the stillness she used when she was fitting pieces together, not speaking, just letting what was said move around until it found its place against what she already knew. She had been sitting with one fact for 3 days that she hadn't brought up yet because she wasn't certain it was what she thought it was. Supplier, she said. Both men looked at her. Harkins, the hardware supplier who was billing the ranch above rate. She looked at Nathan. Went to see him. 2 weeks ago, Nathan said. Claimed it was an accounting error. Agreed to reimburse the overage. Too quickly? She asked, a pause. I thought at the time he was being reasonable. Or he was being careful, she said. She looked at Greer. Rourke's method is to create financial pressure. Inflating supply costs is a quiet way to do it. Doesn't require a legal filing. It just slowly bleeds the operation until the numbers stop working. Greer was very still. You think the supplier was connected to Rourke? I think it's worth knowing whether Harkins supplies any of the other ranches that ended up selling to Rourke's land company, and whether his rates were above market for those properties too. Greer looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Vivian. I can look at that, Greer said slowly. There's a pattern of inflated supply billing correlated with Rourke's acquisition targets. He stopped. Started again. That would be the direct connection we need. That's not a land records office in one county. That's a scheme operating across multiple properties, multiple transactions. It's a different order of charge. I know, Vivian said. I don't know if I'm right. I'm looking at a pattern and it fits. Where would you look? Greer asked. Harkins has other clients, she said. He keeps ledgers. If someone with standing could request to see his business records as part of a legal proceeding. I can do that, Greer said. He was already making notes. If I frame the filing correctly, I can include a discovery provision that covers related business records. He wrote for a moment. He looked up. Mrs. Ashford, where did you study law? I didn't, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Pity, he said, and went back to his notes. That night, after Greer had been given a room for the overnight and Nathan had done his last check of the stable, Vivian sat on the porch in the cold, not because it was comfortable, but because the inside of the house felt suddenly too close for the size of what was moving through it. Sky had cleared after the storm and was enormous and dense with stars the way frontier skies got when there was nothing between you and the distance. She sat with her coat pulled close and looked at it and thought about everything she'd set in motion over the past 2 weeks. She had arrived at this ranch as a woman abandoned at a station. Still true. She had no illusions about what that meant or where she stood. She was an employee, well treated, in a situation that was more complex than she'd expected, with a daughter sleeping upstairs and a legal battle unfolding that she had helped build but did not control. She did not feel fear exactly. What she felt was the specific alertness of a person who knows they are in the middle of something, not the beginning and not the end, but the part where things are most uncertain, where the shape of the outcome is still forming. She heard the door behind her. Nathan came out and stood at the porch rail and looked at the same sky. Didn't say anything for a while. She didn't either. Pitt told me what happened at the fence, he said eventually. 3 head that broke. He already told you I put myself between them and the boundary line. Told me that, yes. It was the right position. Was, he said. That's not what I was going to say. He was quiet again for a moment. I was going to say that you didn't have to do that. Ride out that night. Any of it. She looked at the stars. I know. So why did you? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. 'Cause it mattered, she said finally. And because I was here, and I could. It was quiet. I helped build the case for this ranch, she said. Stopped being just work somewhere in the middle of the attic records and the 3rd cup of cold coffee. She paused. I don't have a better explanation than that. A long silence. Wind moved through the dark beyond the porch and brought with it the smell of wet grass and cold earth, the frontier smell, the one that had nothing polished about it, that smelled like work and weather, and the specific absence of anything easy. Greer's going to file next week, Nathan said. I know. When he does, Rourke will know we're moving against him. I know that too. It could get harder before it gets better. Yes, she said. It likely will. He turned and looked at her in the dark. She turned and looked at him. There was something in that, the looking straight on, neither of them looking away, that said more than the words had, and more than either of them was ready to say out loud yet, which was all right. Some things needed to settle before they could be spoken. Get some sleep, he said. Greer's going to want to go through everything again in the morning. I'll be ready, she said. He went back inside. She sat for another minute, with the stars and the cold and the sound of the ranch around her, a horse shifting in the stable, the low creak of the house. Somewhere in the distance, the creek still running high from the storm, finding its way back to itself. Then she went inside too. Greer filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Victor Rourke knew. Vivian didn't learn this directly. She learned it the way she learned most things in this situation, sideways, from a fragment, a piece of information that arrived through someone else's mouth and meant more than the speaker intended. Dory who mentioned it, not because he was reporting anything, but because he'd been in town for supplies and come back with more than flour and lamp oil. Harkins was in a mood, he said at supper, setting down the supply list for Vivian to check against the invoice. He had a man in his store most of the morning. Didn't introduce himself. Nice coat. Vivian looked at the invoice. What were they talking about? Couldn't hear most of it. Harkins kept his voice down. Dory hesitated. I heard your name, and Nathan's. The table went quiet. Nathan was looking at his plate. Did the thing he did when processing something went very still. Way still water goes still. Nothing on the surface moving. Everything underneath working. What did the man look like? Vivian asked. Dory described him. Mid-40s. Dark coat. Clean-shaven. Carrying a leather satchel. Not a ranch hand. Not a merchant. Someone who handled paper for a living. Rourke's man. Not Rourke himself. Rourke never went anywhere directly, but the layer between Rourke and whatever needed doing. After supper, Nathan found her in the study. He didn't knock. She'd left the door open. Harkins is going to be a problem, he said. I know. She was already looking at her copy of the supply records, the ones she'd annotated 2 weeks ago. If Rourke's offering him something to make the supply billing look like an isolated error rather than a pattern, Harkins will take it. He's been billing above rate for 8 months. He doesn't want that examined in a legal proceeding. Greer's discovery provision covers the request, she said, not the cooperation. If Harkins claims his records were lost or damaged, it becomes harder. She paused. Unless Greer already has copies. Nathan looked at her. Do we? I copied the invoices we had. Everything the W received. She pulled a folder from the organized stack on the desk. It's not his ledger, but it's our side of the transactions. Enough to establish the rate discrepancy even without his records confirming it. She watched Nathan absorb this. The slight easing around his eyes that happened when a problem he'd been holding turned out to be less unmanageable than he'd feared. Copied them before you said anything to me, he said. I copy things when I find them, she said. I assumed we'd need them. He looked at the folder in her hand, then at her. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite respect. It was what happened when those two things existed in the same moment without either winning. I'll send word to Greer tonight, he said. She nodded, went to send it. She sat back down at the desk and looked at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection in the dark glass. She looked tired. She was tired. But there was something in the tiredness that felt different from the exhaustion of the past 2 years, not the hollow kind, the kind that comes from managing grief and loss and constant uncertainty. This was the tiredness of doing something that mattered and fighting to keep it. She could work with this kind. The response from Rourke came the following Monday, and it did not come through a lawyer. It came through the door, in the form of a man named Cutter. That was all the name he gave. Just Cutter, who arrived at the W in a wagon with 2 other men and asked to speak to Nathan Whitmore. He was not aggressive in the way of men who are trying to frighten you directly. It was the other kind, the kind that speaks pleasantly about unpleasant things, which was in some ways more alarming. Vivian was in the kitchen when he arrived. She stayed in the kitchen. She listened. Cutter told Nathan that his employer, he didn't name Rourke, Didn't need to, was prepared to increase his offer on the northern pasture significantly. That the legal proceedings Greer had initiated would be lengthy and expensive for both parties. That there was a simpler resolution available, one that was financially favorable and would allow the WW to continue operating without the distraction of an extended court matter. Nathan told him the property wasn't for sale. Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the same pleasant voice, that he hoped Nathan understood the strain a prolonged legal dispute could put on a ranch operation. That spring financing arrangements could be complicated by outstanding title questions. That these things had a way of creating difficulties that reasonable men might prefer to avoid. I'll pass on the offer, Nathan said. Cutter thanked him for his time. Left. Nathan came into the kitchen and stood by the counter and didn't say anything for a moment. Threatened your spring financing, Vivian said. She had heard it clearly. Implied it. It's not an empty threat. If Rourke has connections with the Territorial Lending Office. He might, Nathan said. I don't know how far it goes. She thought about this. The spring cattle purchase was a significant part of the WW's operating plan for the year. Nathan had mentioned it twice in passing. The way you mentioned something you consider settled a credit arrangement with a lending office in the county seat, the same arrangement he'd used for 3 years. Rourke could compromise that arrangement, or delay it, or make it conditional on the legal dispute being dropped. How quickly could you arrange alternative financing? She asked. Quickly, and not on the same terms. He looked at the window. It would cost us. How much? He named a number. Significant. Not catastrophic, but enough to make the next year harder, to eliminate the margin that kept a ranch operation stable, rather than merely surviving. She was quiet, thinking it through. There's a cattle buyer in Harmon's Crossing, she said slowly. He works with 3 or 4 ranches in this region on a seasonal purchase arrangement. I found his correspondence in the supply records. Nathan's father did business with him years ago. His name is Calloway. Nathan looked at her. Calloway's dead. Died 4 years back. His son took over the business. I found a letter from 2 years ago. She pulled it from the folder she'd already had ready, because she'd found it last week and held it as a possible option against exactly this kind of pressure. He's looking to expand his regional agreements. His rates are slightly worse than the lending office, but not dramatically. He has no connection to the county seat. Nathan took the letter. Read it. Read it again. You found this 2 years ago, he said. I found it last week, she corrected. I was going through the older correspondence. I kept it because I thought we might need an alternative. She paused. I didn't know we'd need it this fast. He set the letter down on the table between them. He looked at it with the expression of a man who was recalibrating again, not the alarmed recalibration of someone outpaced, but the particular look of someone who has been given room to breathe exactly when the air was running thin. I'll write to Calloway today, he said. She nodded, picked up the letter, and then stopped. How far ahead do you think? He asked. Not critically. Genuinely. Far enough, she said. Not far enough. I don't know. She was honest about this because he deserved honesty. I'm trying to stay ahead of the problems. I don't always know which problem is coming next. He nodded slowly. That's all anyone can do, he said, and went to write the letter. The situation moved faster after that. Greer filed the formal challenge to the boundary survey and submitted the water rights agreement as the governing instrument. County court accepted the filing. This meant the new survey was stayed legally suspended pending the proceeding, which meant Nathan's documented water access rights were restored to their pre-survey status while the case was heard. This was the good news. The bad news arrived 2 days later, in a form Vivian had been expecting, but not with this timing. Dory came to find her in the study at mid-morning with a face that told her before he opened his mouth. I need to talk to you, he said. Sit down, she said. Sat. He had his hat in his hands again, turning it by the brim. He was 26 years old, and he had the look of someone carrying something heavy that he'd been carrying for a while. My brother, he said, he owes money to a man in town. It was for about 8 months. It's been manageable, but he stopped. Started over. Someone paid it off, last week. The debt's cleared and the man came to tell me, and he also told me. Another stop. He told me the man who paid it wanted to speak with my brother about employment opportunities. Vivian looked at him. My brother doesn't work here, Dory said. But they didn't ask about my brother. My brother told them he couldn't help. And then they told him to pass along that the offer was open to anyone connected to the WW who might want to supplement their income. He looked at her directly. Told them no. He wanted me to know. She was quiet for a moment. Dory, has anyone approached you directly? No. The answer was immediate and she believed honest. They had, I'd have told Nathan the same day. I know, she said. I'm not questioning that. I'm asking because I need to understand where they're looking, she thought. Brother, is he reliable? He's got debts, Dory said carefully. He's not dishonest. The debt was bad luck, not bad character. He paused. Scared. Whoever cleared the debt, they made it clear it was a favor that could be called back. Debt that could be called back. That was the mechanism. Clear the debt with an implicit understanding that the debtor now owed something: information, access, cooperation. Rourke didn't buy people. He acquired leverage over them. Same patient method applied to individuals that he applied to land. Tell your brother not to speak to anyone else connected to this, she said. Not to agree to meet with anyone. If someone pressures him, he tells you immediately. Yes, ma'am, and Dory. She waited until he looked at her. Tell Nathan today, not because you're in trouble. Because he needs to know. Dory nodded. He went. She sat for a moment with the new information. Settled into the shape she was building, added its piece. Rourke was on 2 tracks simultaneously now: the legal challenge through the county records and Greer's proceeding, and the more direct pressure on the people connected to the ranch. He was not panicking. Panicked men moved too fast and made errors. This was still methodical, which meant he still believed he had time. She thought about the supply ledger question. Harkins. Whether Greer had been able to use the invoices she'd copied to establish the rate discrepancy. She wrote a letter to Greer that afternoon. She asked 2 things: whether the copied invoices were sufficient for the discovery claim, and whether it was possible to trace who had held the debt Dory's brother owed before it was cleared. She sent it with one of the hands riding to town. Greer's reply came in 3 days. The invoices were sufficient. His clerk had already cross-referenced them against the rate records for 2 of the other ranches that had sold the Hollis property and the Linwood property, and Harkins had supplied both of them at above market rates in the period preceding their sales. Pattern held. It was not proof of direction from Rourke, but it was the same method applied to 3 different properties, which was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like coordination. On the second question, the debt Greer's reply was more careful. It made inquiries. The debt had been held by a small lending broker in town, whose books, it turned out, included several other small debts connected to people employed on or near properties Rourke had been interested in. The lending broker was not named in any public document Greer could find, but a clerk in the county seat had mentioned him in an unrelated context as someone known to work with outside financial interests. She read this twice. Then she went and found Nathan. Was in the stable doing the afternoon check, moving through the stalls with the even patience he brought to all physical work thorough, unhurried, hands that knew what they were doing without performing it. Looked up when she came in. She gave him Greer's letter. He read it. The lending broker, he said. He's a node, she said. He's the point where Rourke's financial leverage connects to the people on the ground. Clear a debt here. Acquire a debt there. Create obligation without direct contact. She paused. Greer can establish that the broker works for Rourke, even indirectly, even through one intermediate. That's the direct connection, Nathan said. Yes. Folded the letter. Handed it back. Greer needs to know the broker's name. I think Greer already suspects it, she said. He was careful about how he wrote this. Didn't put the name in the letter. Nathan looked at her. He's protecting it, she said, until he can do something with it, she thought. He may be waiting for something to come from our side. Something that confirms what he suspects without requiring him to have sourced it. Pitt, Nathan said. She hadn't suggested it. She hadn't needed to. Pitt's been in this county for 30 years, she said. He knows people Greer doesn't know. And he already told you about Rourke's man with the camera, Nathan said. He's been paying attention. He has. Yeah. They looked at each other in the stable with the horses shifting around them, and the smell of hay and cold and the particular quality of a conversation between 2 people who have been thinking the same thing from different directions and have arrived at the same place. I'll talk to Pitt tonight, Nathan said. She nodded. He did. What Pitt produced after a conversation with Nathan that lasted the better part of 2 hours was a name. Not the lending broker's name directly. Pitt didn't know that, but the name of a man who had worked for the broker as a messenger, collecting payments and making deliveries, who had also been the man Pitt had seen speaking to Rourke's representative on the street in Millhaven the previous autumn. It was a thread, a thin one, but Greer had built cases on thinner. Nathan sent the name to Calford by express rider the next morning. Ranch waited. This was the hardest part. Vivian recognized it as such even while she was in it. Waiting that comes after you have done what you can do, and the next step belongs to someone else. She kept working because work was what she had, and because there was always more of it, and because the accounts and the supply records and the ongoing management of the W did not pause for legal proceedings. Spring planting preparations needed attention. Cattle in the north paddock needed rotating back to pasture now that the creek had receded. 3 fence posts in the south line needed replacing. She did the accounts. She organized the supply ordering for the next month, sat with Bess, and went through the kitchen supply situation with the focus of 2 women who had decided, without discussing it explicitly, that the running of this house was a form of holding the line. Bess had shifted toward her in some way that was not dramatic and would never be announced. Showed in small things. The coffee was ready when Vivian came downstairs. Kitchen records were left out on the table each morning rather than filed away, as if Bess knew she'd want to look at them. When a ranch hand named Perry made a comment at breakfast about women doing men's work directed at no one specifically, delivered to the room the way cowardly comments are always delivered, Bess put a plate down in front of him with a force that ended the conversation without a word. Vivian said nothing about this to Bess. Bess would have found the gratitude irritating. Molly, meanwhile, had entered a phase of intense interest in the cattle operation that Pitt was doing his level best to manage. She wanted to know everything. How cattle were counted, how they were moved, how you knew which one was which when they all looked the same. Pitt told her they didn't all look the same. She disputed this. He spent an afternoon at the paddock fence proving her wrong by pointing out individual markings, which she then attempted to memorize with a thoroughness that suggested she was treating it as a test she intended to pass. One evening, Vivian found her in the kitchen with Caleb. The 2 of them crouched over a piece of paper on which Molly was attempting to draw the markings of a specific animal from the north herd. Caleb was correcting her patiently. The drawing was not good. Neither of them seemed concerned about this. She stood in the doorway watching for a moment before either of them noticed her. This was what she had come west for, she thought. Not exactly this, not this ranch, not this fight, not this complicated situation she was somewhere in the middle of. Quality of it. The ordinary solidity of people who showed up and did the work and were still there the next day. The thing she had lost when her husband died and not found again until she stepped off a train and knelt in the mud and a stranger offered her something real instead of something that sounded good. She went back to the study. She was going over the Callaway correspondence. Nathan had received a positive reply, and they were working toward a spring agreement that would sidestep the county lending office entirely when she heard the horse on the drive. Fast, moving with intention, not the easy pace of a hand returning from town. She was at the window before she'd decided to be. The rider was one of Greer's clerks, a young man she'd seen once when Greer visited, reliable looking in the way of people who are given important errands because they can be trusted with them. He pulled up, dismounted, was met by Pitt, who came from the stable, and the 2 of them moved toward the house quickly. She was already in the hallway when the knock came. Nathan answered it. The clerk handed him a sealed letter. Nathan broke it, read it. His expression did something she hadn't seen before. It didn't exactly change, but it settled, like a thing that had been held against some pressure for a long time and was suddenly released. Looked at her. Greer found the broker's ledger, he said. She waited. He had a court order by this morning. Broker, his name is Emmett Sears, kept records. Detailed records. Nathan looked back at the letter. Sears kept records of everything. Every debt acquired, every payment cleared, every property connected to the transaction. Kept them because he was afraid Greer thinks he knew what he was part of and kept records to protect himself if it ever went wrong. He paused. Went wrong. Rourke's name is in the records, she said. Not a question. Rourke's name. And a man in the county records office named Foster. 2 others Greer says he'll identify in the proceeding. He set the letter down. Greer is filing a full fraud complaint with the territorial court. Goes above the county level. Above the county level meant above Rourke's reach in this particular county. It meant the proceeding would be handled by people who didn't owe Rourke anything, who hadn't been quietly working in his interest for the past several years. Meant the method had failed. Vivian stood in the hallway of the W and felt the weight of the past 3 weeks settle differently, not lifting, because things like this didn't simply lift, but changing shape. Coming something she could put down, rather than something she had to keep carrying. Foster, she said, the county records official. Yes, he'll be investigated. Greer says he's already cooperating. Sears' records implicate him specifically enough that cooperation was his best option. Nathan looked at her. He's provided additional documentation. Things Rourke's operation sent through his office that he retained copies of. She looked at the letter in Nathan's hand. It's over, she said. Then she corrected herself. The worst of it's over. Proceeding will take time, he said. Rourke has lawyers. He'll fight the fraud charge, delay it if he can. But the boundary claim is dead. The land company loses the standing to claim any interest in the northern pasture. He paused. The water rights agreement stands. She nodded. From outside, she heard Pitt's voice. He'd been standing by the door and had heard enough calling something across the yard to Caleb. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone of them. Tone of a man who has been holding tension for a long time, releasing it in a single sentence. Molly appeared at the top of the stairs. What happened? Why is Pitt yelling? It's not yelling, Vivian said. He's just talking loudly. Why? Good news, Nathan said. Molly came down the stairs in her two-footed stomp, looked at both of them, read their faces with the uncanny accuracy of a child who had grown up watching her mother's expressions for information. Really good news, she said. Really good news, Vivian said. Molly considered this with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. Can I go tell Sergeant? Sergeant is a horse, Vivian said. Doesn't understand good news. He might, Molly said, and went out the door. Nathan watched her go. Then he looked at Vivian with an expression that had shed something the particular weight that had been in his face since the first morning she'd shown him the mismatched invoices. Still a serious face. It was still the face of a man who had been through difficulty and would go through more before things were fully settled. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been visible before. I owe you more than I can calculate, he said. You offered me fair work, she said. I did it. That's not all you did. She looked at him steadily. No, it's not. She didn't see the point in false modesty. It was work, and it was work I chose. She paused. Gave me the room to do it. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Greer asked whether you'd be willing to speak to the territorial court if needed, as a witness regarding the document organization and what you found in the attic records. Of course, she said. He also asked whether I thought you'd be interested in work with his office. Not immediately. After the proceeding, he said it carefully, watching her face. He needs someone who can read land records the way you read them. He had an office manager for 15 years who retired last fall, and he hasn't found anyone who does what she did. She stood with this for a moment. What did you tell him? She said. I told him that was your decision, Nathan said. Not mine. She appreciated that he'd said it that way, that he hadn't decided for her, hadn't assumed. Yeah, it was the same quality she'd noticed in the road in Millhaven when he'd offered her work and then given her the space to choose it. Tell him I'll think about it, she said. He nodded, turned toward the study. She had the Callaway correspondence to finish and the supply order to review before supper, and the fact that the worst of the immediate crisis had resolved didn't mean the ranch's operations had paused. Work was still there. It was always there. She was halfway down the hall when she stopped. She turned back. Nathan. He was still standing where she'd left him, looking at the letter in his hand. Looked up. The first morning, she said. You showed me the invoices and the survey documents, and you said the supply situation had been a mess since August. I asked what happened in August. She paused. You told me about your wife. She'd left in July. He was very still. I've never said anything about that, she said. I won't unless you want to. She met his eyes. But I want you to know I understand what it took to keep this ranch running through all of it. Before I came. What it took to keep it together on your own. He looked at her for a long moment. It was harder than I let on, he said finally. I know, she said. I could see it in the numbers. Something shifted in his face. The first real movement of something that had been under the surface the whole time, not quite a smile, because it was too serious for that, but a motion in the direction of one. Expression of a man who has been known in a way he did not expect, and finds it is all right. Go do your accounts, he said. She went. Outside, she could hear Molly at the paddock fence talking to Sergeant in the earnest way she talked to all living things, explaining something at length that the horse received with his usual equanimity. Beyond the stable, Pitt and Caleb were doing the late afternoon rounds with the ease of men who have just put down a weight. Ranch was making its end of day sounds the settling and the work and the small functional business of 60 people and animals moving toward evening. Sat down at the desk. She picked up the Callaway letter. She went back to work. The territorial court proceeding began 6 weeks after Greer filed. Vivian knew this because Greer wrote to Nathan with the date, and Nathan left the letter on the kitchen table where she would see it, which was the way they had come to handle information that concerned them both, not formally presented, not explained, just made available. It was an efficient system, and also, she had noticed, a quietly trusting one. You left things where the other person could find them. You assumed they would. She had been at the Double W for 2 months by then. 2 months was not a long time. She understood that. She had lived through long time the 11 days at her husband's bedside, the 8 months of Thomas Altdean's letters building a future that did not exist, and she knew what long felt like. 2 months was not it. 2 months was a beginning, and beginnings were tender things that broke easily if you handled them wrong. Something had changed in the texture of the days that she couldn't account for purely by the resolution of the legal crisis. Ranch was running well. The accounts were clean. Callaway agreement had been signed, and the spring cattle arrangement was in place independent of the county lending office, which meant Rourke's threatened pressure point had never materialized. North pasture fence had been properly repaired, not patched this time, but rebuilt in the soft ground section with a deeper post method Pitt had learned somewhere and had never had authorization to implement until Vivian looked at the repair costs of 3 patches versus 1. Proper fix and made the case to Nathan in 2 sentences. These were practical improvements. Good ones. They were not what had changed the texture. What had changed was harder to name, and she was careful not to name it prematurely, because she had made the error before of building something in her mind from materials that looked solid and turned out to be paper. She had crossed a country on the basis of letters. She was not going to do something equivalent again, not while she was still finding her footing, not while the situation was still in motion. So she worked. She got up early and went to bed late, and in between she did what needed doing, and she let the days accumulate without demanding that they mean something yet. Territorial Court was in a town called Delridge, 4 hours south. Greer had told Nathan he would need to appear in person for 1 day of testimony, possibly 2, but that the primary proceeding would be handled through the documentary evidence, which was extensive. Broker Emmett Sears was cooperating fully. The county records official Foster had provided documentation that, according to Greer's careful language, was more than sufficient. Victor Rourke's lawyers had filed 3 separate motions to delay or dismiss in the weeks since the complaint was lodged. All 3 had been denied. Rourke was not accustomed to being denied. Nathan left for Delridge on a Wednesday with Greer, who had ridden up from Calford the night before and eaten Bess's supper, and sat at the kitchen table with Vivian for an hour going through the testimony preparation. Greer had given her the questions he expected Nathan to be asked and the order in which the documentary evidence would be introduced, and she had gone through the sequence twice to make sure it was tight. "Should be the one testifying," Greer said, near the end of the hour. "Nathan was the property owner," she said. "The testimony needs to come from him. The analysis came from you. The analysis supports his testimony. That's what it's for." She closed the folder. "He knows the material. We went through it together." Greer looked at her with the measured expression he used when he was deciding whether to push a point. "Decided not to. I'll send word as soon as the proceeding concludes," he said. "I'll be here," she said. Nathan left at first light. She watched the wagon go down the drive from the porch, the same way she'd watched him leave for Calford 6 weeks ago. And she stood there an extra minute after the wagon had disappeared and looked at the country around the ranch, the wide, cold sky. The pastures beginning to show the first hesitant color of approaching spring. Sargent visible through the stable fence, standing with the preoccupied dignity of an animal who has decided the morning is acceptable. She went inside. She went to work. Molly, with the instinct of children for when adults need distraction, declared that morning an appropriate time to learn to braid. She appeared in the kitchen after breakfast with a length of leather cord she'd acquired from somewhere and presented herself to Vivian with the air of someone scheduling a lesson. "Where did you get that?" Vivian said. "Caleb said I could have it. Caleb is very generous with things that aren't his. Said it was a scrap." Vivian looked at the leather cord. It was in fact a scrap. She sat down at the table and showed Molly how to braid left over center, right over center. Steady repeating logic of it, and Molly's small hands worked at it with the serious concentration she brought to everything she decided was worth learning. She was better at it than Vivian expected. The first attempt was uneven, but the principle took hold quickly, and by the 3rd try the braid had a real shape to it. "It's like numbers," Molly said, studying her own work. "How so?" "There's a pattern if you do it the same way every time it comes out right." Vivian looked at her daughter, 5 years old. Her father's eyes, her father's stubbornness, and something else that Vivian was increasingly certain was neither of them something that had come in its own direction. That would go in directions Vivian couldn't predict yet, that already showed a way of seeing the world that was entirely its own. It's like numbers. Sat in the kitchen braiding until Bess needed the table for lunch preparation, and Molly took her leather cord outside to show Pitt. Vivian went back to the study. Then the morning passed the way mornings do when you're waiting for something slowly in the moment, fast in retrospect. Word from Delridge came on Friday. Not a letter, a telegram, which meant Greer had considered the news worth the speed. Nan brought it himself, arriving back at the ranch late Friday afternoon, with the look of a man who had been sitting with something significant for 4 hours of road and was ready to put it down somewhere. Came into the kitchen, where Vivian was reviewing the monthly accounts with Bess's kitchen supply list, and he set the telegram on the table in front of her. She read it. Victor Rourke's boundary claim had been struck. Fraudulent survey had been voided by the territorial court and removed from the county record. The water rights agreement, Nathan's father's handwritten document, found in a misfiled folder in the attic of the ranch it had protected for 15 years, had been formally recognized as the governing instrument for the Northern Creek access. Land Company's interest in the eastern parcel was under separate investigation for the property transfers involving the Hollis and Linwood ranches. Foster, the county records official, had been removed from his position pending a full investigation. He had provided testimony implicating 2 others in the county structure. Victor Rourke himself had been named as the directing party in a scheme to defraud multiple landowners through the coordinated use of manipulated land records, inflated supplier billing, and targeted debt acquisition. The territorial court had referred the matter to the Federal Circuit for further proceeding on the fraud charges. Federal Circuit. Rourke had been building a machine in this county for 3 years, and the machine was going to be examined by a court that operated above the level where his local connections had any weight. Vivian set the telegram down. She looked at Nathan. He looked at her. "It's done," he said. "The fraud proceeding will take time," she said. Careful, because she had learned to be careful with conclusions. "Ranch is done," he said. "The boundary claim, the water rights, the survey. Done." He sat down across from her. He looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been running on tension for months and has just felt it cut loose. Greer said the other ranches, Hollis and Linwood, may be able to contest their sales. He thinks the fraud finding gives them grounds. She thought about the Hollis barn fire. "The Linwood well, I hope they do," she said. He also said. Nathan stopped. He was doing the thing he did, taking time with something that mattered. He said the case is going to be referenced in the territorial legal record. An example of a fraud pattern and how it was identified. He paused. Said, "Your name is going to be in that record. The summary you wrote. Document organization. The water rights agreement. Supply billing analysis." He said it's all going into the record. Quiet for a moment. She thought about what it meant for her name to be in a legal record as the person who had identified a fraudulent pattern. Not as a witness, not as a supporting party, but as the person who had seen it, named it, built the evidentiary foundation that made it prosecutable. She thought about what her husband would have said. He would have said something dry and accurate. Delivered without sentiment, he'd been that kind of man. Not cold but economical. Someone who showed what he felt through what he did rather than what he said. He would have looked at her with those specific eyes and said something like, "Well, there it is." And she would have known exactly what he meant. She felt his absence the way she sometimes did not as grief exactly. Not anymore, but as a shape in the room. Particular kind of quiet where a person used to be. "Offered me the position again," she said. "The one in his office." Nathan was very still. "I know," he said. "He wrote to me separately about it," she said. "Last week." She had not told Nathan this yet. She had not been ready to have the conversation it opened. "What did you tell him?" Nathan's voice was even. She could not read what was underneath it. "I told him I was still thinking," she said. The kitchen was quiet. Bess was in the other room. Outside she could hear Pitt and Dory finishing up the afternoon work, the specific sounds of a ranch settling toward evening. "Culford is 4 hours," Nathan said. "I know. Greer's office is permanent work. Professional. The kind of work he stopped. The kind of work that fits what you can do." "I know that too," she said. "But Molly would have to change schools. She's only just settled." "I know." He was quiet. "Then I'm not going to tell you what to do." I know that too, she said. You never have. She looked at him. That's one of the things I notice about you. Something moved in his face. Let it. Which was also something she noticed, that he didn't always manage his expression in front of her the way he managed it in front of other people. Whether he was aware of this, she couldn't say. Then what are you thinking? He said. She looked at the telegram on the table between them. She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I came west as a mail-order bride and ended up managing a ranch and building a fraud case and riding into a storm in your dead housekeeper's husband's coat. And I'm thinking that I came here looking for stability and found something considerably more complicated than that. She paused. And I'm thinking that complicated is not the same as wrong. He looked at her. I'm also thinking, she said, that I have stayed somewhere before because I needed to and not because I chose to. I've learned the difference matters. What does choosing look like? He asked. It was a genuine question. She could tell because he asked it without any pressure, in it not trying to direct the answer, just asking what she actually thought. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's what I'm still working out. She looked at him steadily. Does that bother you? That I don't know yet? He considered it. No, he said. I'd rather have the honest answer. So would I, she said. They sat for a moment with the question still open between them, which was uncomfortable and also correct. Some things required the discomfort of staying open. Closing them too quickly was how you ended up building on paper when you needed stone. Bess appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who has been in the other room long enough to have a general sense of the conversation's shape and has decided this is a good moment to be useful. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table without being asked and went back out without saying anything. Vivian picked up her cup. Nathan picked up his. Thank you, she said. For not deciding this for me. It's your decision, he said. It affects you, she said. And Molly. And this ranch. Yes, he said. But it's still yours. She looked at him across the table. The lines in his face that had been put there by weather and work, and something harder than either. At the way he held the coffee cup with both hands, which was a habit she'd noticed early and never mentioned, the unconscious gesture of a man who'd spent years coming in from cold mornings. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not looked at seen. Difference between those two things was the whole of it, and she knew from experience how rare the second one was. She thought about Molly at the paddock fence drawing cattle markings with Caleb. Molly whistling the tune Caleb had taught her, 2 notes at a time, walking through the kitchen. Got Molly telling Sargent about good news. She thought about what she'd felt in that mud at the train station, not just the humiliation and the cold, but the specific desolation of having built a future on someone else's promise and arrived to find nothing there. She had promised herself, kneeling in that mud, that the next thing she built would be built on what was actually there, on what she could see and verify and touch. She could see what was actually here. She wrote to Greer 3 days later. She told him she was grateful for the offer and that she took it seriously, and that she had a condition. She would take the position but part-time, traveling to Calford 2 days a week to start, with the arrangement reviewed at 6 months. She would continue her work at the W in a formal capacity, with compensation adjusted to reflect the professional nature of what she was doing. She would need a written agreement with Nathan for both arrangements. She wrote to Nathan separately and said the same thing. His reply was 2 sentences. The written agreement is a good idea. I'll have one drawn up. She sent the letter to Greer. The arrangement took 2 weeks to formalize. During that time she continued working, because work was constant and arrangements didn't pause it. She reorganized the filing system in the study to accommodate the new workload. Greer was going to send her preliminary document reviews to work on between office visits, which would require her to have a cleaner system than even the one she'd built. She was doing exactly this on a Thursday afternoon. When Molly came into the study, without knocking, she had never successfully trained Molly to knock and stood in the doorway with a piece of paper. What's that? Vivian said. I drew Nathan's ranch, Molly said. She held it out. Vivian took it. The drawing showed the main house, recognizable primarily by the porch, with a large smudge that was probably Sargent in front of it, and several square shapes that were apparently cattle. Figures stood in front of the house. Vivian could identify herself by the long dress and a taller figure that was Nathan, and 2 other smaller shapes, she guessed, were Pitt and Caleb. It's very good, Vivian said. It's not that good, Molly said, with the critical honesty of a child who had been looking at the drawing long enough to see its flaws. Sargent's head is too big. It's a little big, Vivian agreed. Molly looked at the drawing in her mother's hands. We staying? She asked. The question arrived without ceremony. The way Molly's important questions always did, dropped into the middle of whatever was happening, without preamble or apology. Because she had not yet learned that adults preferred to circle the important things before landing on them. Vivian looked at her daughter. At the drawing. Yes, she said. We're staying. Molly took the drawing back. Good, she said. I want to learn about the calves in the spring. She left. Vivian sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to work. The formal legal resolution of the Rourke matter extended over the following months, as these things do, in the way of proceedings that have multiple threads and multiple parties and require the territorial court to work through them in sequence. Vivian was called to Delridge once to provide supporting testimony about the document analysis and the supply billing pattern. She sat in the court building a solid stone structure that smelled of old paper and wood polish and answered Greer's questions in the clear, organized way she answered all questions, and watched the court recorder write down what she said with the particular attention courts paid a testimony they find credible. Rourke's lawyers objected to several of her answers, on grounds she could tell even from her position as a layperson were technical, rather than substantive, not challenging what she'd found, but trying to limit its scope. Court allowed her testimony in full. She rode back to the Double W that evening and found Nathan on the porch. Been waiting, she could tell by the way he was sitting, not relaxed but alert, facing the drive. How did it go? He asked. Well, I think, she said. Greer seemed satisfied. What did they ask? She told him. Going through it, the way she went through most things with him now in order, without dramatizing, noting what mattered and not elaborating on what didn't. He listened the same way he always listened, with the full attention of someone who had decided what you were saying was worth hearing. When she was done, he said, You did the most important work 6 months ago. In the attic with those boxes. Anyone could have found that document, she said. Didn't, he said. You did. He looked at her. There's a difference. She was quiet. You know, she said after a moment. I spent a long time after my husband died, believing that the practical things I was good at the accounts. The records. Numbers were useful, but not significant. That significance was in other things. She paused. I'm not sure where I got that idea. He didn't think so. He always said, the person who reads the numbers clearly is the person who sees the truth clearly. He was right, Nathan said. He was often right, she said. It was one of his less endearing qualities. Nathan made the sound that was almost a laugh. It came more easily now than it had in those first weeks. She had noticed this the way you notice a season changing not in a single moment but in accumulation, in the gradual emergence of something that had been there underneath, waiting for the conditions. They sat on the porch in the early spring evening, not saying much else. The light was staying longer now. Days beginning to hold warmth into the afternoon. Pastures green in a way that was different from the gray-green of winter, a more committed color. She had been thinking, in the weeks since the court testimony, about something she couldn't quite resolve. Not a practical problem, the practical problems were largely in hand. Something else. The question of what it meant to have arrived somewhere by accident and found yourself choosing to stay. Whether that was wisdom or just exhaustion presenting itself as certainty. She had made a decision before, at the end of those 8 months of letters, that had turned out to be wrong. Not because she'd been foolish, she had done everything reasonable people did when they evaluated a situation. She'd read the letters carefully. She'd asked the practical questions. She'd tried to assess the man from what he put on paper. She had simply been deceived by someone better at deception than she was at detecting it. That was the part she had to hold carefully, the part that still sat in her chest like a weight on cold mornings. Not shame exactly, she had mostly worked through shame. Something more stubborn than shame. The specific reluctance of a person who has been fooled once toward being anything that could be called trusting again. She had been thinking about this and sitting with it, and on this particular evening she decided to say it out loud because she was tired of carrying it silently and because the person beside her had earned the honesty. I want to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. When I came west, I thought I had made a careful decision. I thought I had been reasonable and practical and sensible, and I had, but I was still wrong. She looked at the pasture. And I've been aware, since I've been here, that my judgment told me that situation was safe. My judgment was wrong. And that has made it difficult to fully trust my own judgment about this. She didn't wave her hand, but he understood what she meant by this. He was quiet for a moment. You think you could be wrong about staying? I think I'm aware, that I could be wrong about anything. More aware than I'd like to be. He nodded slowly. That's honest. I try to be. I know you do. He looked at the pasture, too. I'll tell you something back, if that's all right. Please, she said. When I offered you work at the station, it was because I needed someone practical, and you looked like you were practical. He paused. That was the beginning of it. And it would have been enough if that was all. It was a practical arrangement. Well managed. Satisfactory. I have had arrangements like that, and they're fine. He looked at her. This stopped being that kind of arrangement a long time ago. She looked at him. I don't know how to tell you that in a way that isn't pressure, he said. And I'm not trying to make it pressure. You said you're still working it out. That's fine. Take the time you need. He looked back at the pasture. I just didn't want you to think your judgment about this place, about what this has become, was working with bad information. It's not. What you see here is what's here. She was quiet for a moment. What you see is what's here, she said. Yes, she thought about that. About what it meant to be given that assurance without conditions attached to it, not as a promise of anything, not as a request, just as a fact offered plainly by a man who said what he meant. My husband used to say, she said quietly, that the most honest thing you could give someone was accurate information. Not comfort, not reassurance, just accurate information and the space to decide. Sounds like he was a good man, Nathan said. He was, she said. He was also stubborn and occasionally infuriating, and he could hold a position past the point where it was useful. She paused. He was good. I'm sorry he's gone. So am I, she said. Every day, but differently now than I used to. They sat a while longer. Spring settled around the double W over the weeks that followed in the particular, unhurried way of seasons that don't ask permission. Calves came 12 of them in the first group, and Molly was present for 2 of the births by a campaign of persistence directed at Pitt that he had eventually, inevitably, capitulated to. She stood at the fence and watched with a focus that was absolutely silent, which was so unlike her ordinary mode that Pitt said afterward it was the first time in 5 months he'd heard more than 30 consecutive seconds of quiet from that direction. Greer arrangement settled into its rhythm. 2 days a week, she rode to Calford with whoever was going to town. Or on the horse Nathan had quietly allocated to her use without making a formal announcement of this, just mentioned one morning that the bay mare on the eat end was getting lazy and needed regular riding, and she was the most consistent rider at the moment. She had accepted this without comment because they had developed, over months, a language for these things that did not require full sentences. Work at Greer's office was different from the ranch work in texture but not in kind. It was still records and numbers and the patient detective work of finding what didn't match and understanding why. Greer had cases from 3 other counties, land disputes and estate challenges, and one complicated water rights matter that made the double W case look simple. Gave her the documentary foundation work, organizing, cross-referencing, building the evidentiary timeline, and she was good at it in a way that required no adjustment period. You're doing in 2 days a week what my last person did in 5, he said about a month in. Last person had more interruptions, she said. I work better with fewer. Do you want more hours? Not yet, she said. Ask me in the fall. He asked her in the fall. She said yes, 3 days a week. The arrangement with the double W adjusted accordingly, with a formal written agreement that Nathan had Greer himself draw up, which she found slightly amusing and chose not to mention. Rourke fraud proceeding concluded in late summer. The federal circuit found against him on 4 counts. His land company's assets were frozen pending the proceeding outcome. The Hollis and Linwood families both filed suits to contest their ranch sales, and Greer took both cases on reduced fee because he considered them worth taking. Victor Rourke appealed. This was expected and had been planned for. The appeal would take longer than the original proceeding, and the outcome was not guaranteed. But the boundary claim and the water rights determination were insulated from the appeal. They had been settled separately and fully, and no appeal of the fraud proceeding could unsettle them. Double W's northern pasture was secure. The water rights were documented, recognized, and permanently on record. Rourke had lost the thing he'd come for. Harkins, the hardware supplier, settled separately. He returned the overage amounts to the 3 ranches he'd been billing above rate, paid a fine assessed by the county court, and lost 3 of his largest accounts in the process. Stayed in business. Vivian didn't particularly want him ruined, just corrected but on different terms. Emmett Sears, the broker, received a reduced consequence in exchange for his testimony and his records, which had proven to be the most useful single document in the entire proceeding. His meticulous, fear-driven record-keeping, maintained because he'd always suspected the scheme would eventually collapse and wanted protection when it did, had been the thread that unraveled everything. There was something in that she thought about, sometimes the way the most useful evidence had come from the most compromised person, from his own self-interested caution. It wasn't inspiring exactly. It was just true. On a Thursday in early autumn, Vivian was in the study when Nathan knocked on the open door. She looked up. He was holding something, a small package, wrapped in cloth, which he set on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. "Open it," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a deed, the double W letterhead Greer's formal hand properly witnessed. She read it carefully, which took a moment because she was making sure she understood what she was reading. It was a formal stake in the double W operations. Not ownership, not his half of the ranch, nothing so large or so fast. But a documented equity interest in the operating accounts, the kind of instrument that gave the holder legitimate standing in business decisions affecting those accounts. She looked up at him. "Greer drew it up," he said. "I asked him to, after the fall review, Nathan. You've been managing the accounts for 8 months. Found the fraud. You built the legal case. Rode out in a storm and saved 3 head from the wrong side of the boundary line." He stopped. "What you do here isn't housekeeper work. It stopped being that about a week in. Reflects what's actually true." She looked at the document again. She thought about Gerald Pritchard throwing her suitcase into the mud. She thought about kneeling in the frozen dirt, gathering her dresses and her daughter's socks, and the letters that had brought her nowhere. She thought about climbing into a stranger's wagon because there was nothing else to climb into, because the alternative was a hotel with $14.60 and no plan. She thought about what it meant to have started there and arrived here. Not a fairy tale version of arrived, not arrived into perfection or certainty or the end of difficulty. Just arrived into something real, something she had helped build with her own hands and her own mind, something that had her name on it now in Harlan Greer's careful formal script. Her eyes did something she didn't entirely prevent. She pressed her fingers to the corner of one eye, a brief, efficient gesture, and straightened. "It's very well structured," she said. Her voice was level. "Greer does clean work." "He said you'd say something like that," Nathan said. "He was right," she said. She set the document down on the desk. She looked at it. Then she looked at him, standing in the doorway of the study that had become, over 8 months, as much hers as his. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "Think loudly. For a quiet person." "I've been thinking," she said again, "about what you said in the spring. About what you see being what's here." He waited. "I believe you," she said. "I've believed you for a while. I was just making sure I was believing it for the right reasons and not the convenient ones." She paused. "I think I'm sure now." He was very still. "I'm not sure what that means exactly," she said. "Practical terms. What shape it takes." She looked at the deed on the desk. "But I thought you should know." "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you're going to say?" "Said you weren't sure of the shape yet," he said. "I'm not going to rush the shape." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are occasionally infuriating," she said. "Probably," he said. Didn't say it with any particular defensiveness. Just acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge weather. She turned back to the desk. She had work to do. She had Greer's new water rights matter to begin reviewing, and the fall supply order to finalize, and the monthly accounts to close. "Nathan," she said without turning. "Yes, thank you." "Document. It's accurate," he said. "That's all." He went. She sat with the deed in front of her for another minute. Autumn light came through the study window and fell across it. Greer's handwriting, Nathan's signature, official stamp of the county, and the line that carried her name. Vivian Ashford. She thought about what it meant to be that person. Not the person who had arrived at a train station with a broken suitcase and a 5-year-old daughter and nothing else. Not the person who had failed at the thing she'd come west to do. Not the person kneeling in the mud. That person was still in her. Guy, you didn't leave behind the moments that had shaped you, you carried them forward, and sometimes they were ballast, and sometimes they were anchor, and eventually, Rick, if you were honest and patient with yourself, they became something closer to foundation. She had not come west and become someone different. She had come west and become more fully herself, in conditions that demanded it, among people who had the particular grace of needing what she actually had to offer, rather than what she'd been told she was supposed to offer. That was the thing, she thought. That was the whole of it. Outside, she heard Molly's voice rising from the direction of the paddock. explaining something to someone with great conviction. Then Pitt's voice, lower, the steady, patient answer of a man who had decided, against his own better judgment, that this child's education was partly his responsibility. Then silence while Molly processed the answer. Then her voice again, with a new question. It would never stop, that voice. Questions would just get larger as she grew. More complicated, harder to answer. And eventually she would stop asking Pitt and start figuring things out for herself. Gah, and that would be good, even when it was frightening. Vivian was looking forward to it. She picked up Greer's water rights file. She read the first page. She found her pen. The autumn light moved across the desk as the morning progressed, slow and honest, illuminating what it found. She went to work.